Welcome to Crime Stories for Sleep. Tonight, before we begin, I want to ask you something simple. Where are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Think about that quietly, let the question settle, and when you're ready, allow yourself to drift into the story. The basement of the 3rd Precinct held more than evidence. It held time itself, suspended in the amber glow of overhead fluorescent lights that hummed their steady electric lullaby through the endless rows of filing cabinets. Detective Sarah Chun had discovered this place 3 months ago, not through assignment or curiosity, but through accident. A wrong turn while looking for the records department had led her down a forgotten staircase, through a door marked only with peeling numbers that no one seemed to remember the meaning of. The air here was different, thick with the weight of paper and ink, heavy with the accumulated breath of decades. Each footstep on the concrete floor echoed softly, absorbed by the thousands upon thousands of manila folders that lined the metal shelves stretching from floor to ceiling. The folders were organized by year, then by case number, then by a system so intricate and forgotten that even the oldest clerks upstairs could only shrug when asked about it. Sarah found herself returning to this place during the quiet hours, not to solve cases or chase leads, but simply to sit among the collected silence of the city's archived sorrows. The newest files here dated back 15 years. The oldest disappeared into shadows at the far end of the basement, where the overhead lights had long since burned out, and no one had bothered to replace them. She had begun with a folder chosen at random. Case number 1987040847. The paper inside was yellowed at the edges, the typewritten words slightly faded but still legible. A break-in at a hardware store on Maple Street. Nothing stolen, just an open door found by the morning shift worker, Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez, who had worked there for 23 years and always arrived at exactly 7:15 each morning with her coffee still steaming in its paper cup. The responding officer, Patrolman James Mitchell, had noted the precise details in his careful handwriting. The door handle showed no signs of tampering. The register remained locked and undisturbed. The inventory revealed nothing missing, not even the handful of loose change left in the small jar by the receipt book. But someone had been inside. Someone had walked through the narrow aisles between the stacked paint cans and coiled garden hoses, had perhaps run their fingers along the wooden handles of the hammers and screwdrivers, had stood for moments unknown in the darkness among the sleeping tools. Sarah found something deeply peaceful in these details. Not the mystery of who had entered the store, or why, but the simple fact that Officer Mitchell had cared enough to document everything. The way the morning light fell through the store's front window. The smell of turpentine that Mrs. Vasquez mentioned lingered more strongly than usual. The small spider web in the corner near the fertilizer display that seemed undisturbed, suggesting the intruder had kept to the main walkways. These observations had been typed onto official forms, filed in proper order, and then slowly forgotten as newer cases demanded attention. But they remained here in the steady fluorescent glow, waiting for someone to remember that Mrs. Vasquez had worked at that store for 23 years, that she arrived each morning at 7:15, that her coffee was still steaming when she discovered what someone else had left behind in the darkness. That the next folder held a different kind of silence. Case number 1989-21203, a noise complaint from Riverside Drive. Logged at 2:17 in the morning by Officer Patricia Wong. The caller, Mr. Harold Steinberg from apartment 4B, reported sounds of furniture being moved in the apartment directly above his own. Heavy pieces dragged across the floor, the scraping and bumping continuing for nearly an hour before falling silent again. Officer Wong had climbed the stairs to apartment 5B, had knocked softly first, then with more authority. No response. The hallway smelled of cabbage and old cigarettes, scents that seemed to live permanently in the building's walls. She had tried the door handle locked, as expected. had listened carefully with her ear against the wood silence, complete and undisturbed. The neighbors on either side reported hearing nothing unusual, though Mrs. Chun in 5A mentioned that the apartment above Mr. Steinberg had been empty for 6 months, ever since the previous tenant, an elderly woman named Rose Murphy, had moved to live with her daughter in another. Staked out, the report concluded, with Officer Wong's recommendation to check with the building superintendent in the morning about possible maintenance work or unauthorized entry. But the follow-up report, filed 3 days later, noted that the superintendent, Mr. Rodriguez, had no record of any work scheduled for that apartment, no knowledge of anyone having access to the empty unit, and no explanation for the sounds that had troubled Mr. Steinberg's sleep. Sarah imagined Officer Wong climbing those stairs again, perhaps during daylight this time, perhaps with the superintendent's ring of keys jingling softly as they approached apartment 5B. She pictured the door opening onto emptiness, bare walls, clean floors, windows that looked out onto the river where barges moved slowly through the gray morning water. An apartment that held nothing but the memory of Rose Murphy's life, the faint impressions where her furniture had once stood, the subtle discoloration on the walls where her pictures had hung for years before she packed them away and moved to her daughter's house, where the rooms smelled different and the sounds of the city were muffled by newer walls and better windows. Someone had been in that empty apartment at 2:17 in the morning. Someone had moved furniture that no longer existed, had dragged heavy pieces across floors that bore no such marks when Officer Wong returned with the superintendent's keys. The sounds had been real enough to wake Mr. Steinberg, real enough to prompt a call to the police, real enough to bring Officer Wong up those stairs with her flashlight, cutting through the dim hallway and her radio crackling, softly with the distant voices of other officers, handling other calls in other parts of the city where other mysteries played out in the darkness. These folders began to blur together in Sarah's mind, not because they were similar, but because they were all part of something larger. Each case represented a moment when the ordinary rhythm of the city had been disturbed, when someone had called for help or reported something strange, when officers had responded with their notebooks and their careful observations and their professional dedication too, recording what could be seen and measured, and filed away for future reference. Case number 1991072-156, a wallet found in Centennial Park, turned in by a jogger who ran the same route every morning at 6 o'clock. The wallet contained $43 in cash, several credit cards, a driver's license for one Michael Thompson of Oak Street, and a faded photograph of a young woman standing in front of a Ferris wheel. Officer David Kim had attempted to contact Mr. Thompson at the address listed on his license, but the house at that address had been demolished 2 years earlier to make way for a shopping center. The phone number led to a disconnected line. The credit cards had been canceled years ago. According to the customer service representatives who checked their systems with the patient efficiency of people accustomed to such inquiries, the jogger who found the wallet, a woman named Jennifer Martinez, mentioned that she had been running the same route for 5 years and had never seen the wallet before. It wasn't weathered or water damaged, suggesting it hadn't been lying in the park for very long. But Michael Thompson seemed to have vanished as completely as if he had never existed, leaving behind only this collection of items that had once defined his place in the world and now served as evidence of his absence. Officer Kim had filed the wallet in the precinct's property room, where it joined thousands of other unclaimed items waiting for owners who might never return. The report concluded with a note that the case would remain open pending further information, but Sarah knew that no further information had ever come. Michael Thompson remained lost, his wallet a small mystery filed away, between a bicycle recovered from the river and a set of car keys found on a downtown sidewalk with no car in sight. Asterisk, she wondered about the photograph in the wallet. The young woman standing in front of the Ferris wheel. Had she been waiting for Michael Thompson to contact her? Had she wondered why he never called? Why he seemed to disappear from her life as completely as he had disappeared from his Oak Street address? Or perhaps she had forgotten him years ago, had moved on to other relationships and other photographs, had no idea that her image still resided in a wallet sitting in a police property room, a fragment of someone else's past preserved in fluorescent light and climate-controlled air. The deeper Sarah ventured into the files, the more she understood that she was exploring not just the city's criminal history, but its emotional geography. Each case represented a moment when someone's normal life had been interrupted, when the predictable patterns of daily existence had been disturbed by something unexpected or unexplained. The files contained not just facts and evidence, but the residue of human confusion, the careful documentation of moments when people had reached out to the police because they didn't. Nowhere else to turn. Case number 1993-110934. Report of suspicious activity filed by Mrs. Agnes Kowalski, age 78, who lived alone in a house on Elm Street that she had shared with her husband for 46 years before his death the previous winter. Mrs. Kowalski called police at 11:40 at night to report that someone was playing music in her backyard. Not loud music, she explained to Officer Maria Santos, but soft music, like a radio playing at low volume somewhere among the trees behind her house. Officer Santos had walked through Mrs. Kowalski's backyard with her flashlight, had examined the area thoroughly, had found no radio, no boombox, no source for the music that Mrs. Kowalski insisted she could still hear even as they stood together in the darkness. The neighboring yards showed no signs of activity. The houses on either side were dark, their occupants presumably asleep. Officer Santos had listened carefully, but heard only the usual nighttime sounds: distant traffic, the hum of air conditioning units, the occasional car door slamming on the street out front. The report noted that Mrs. Kowalski seemed alert and oriented, showed no signs of confusion or distress beyond her concern about the music. She had lived in the house for nearly 5 decades, knew every sound the neighborhood made at different hours, could distinguish between the normal and the unusual with the expertise that comes from years of careful listening. If she heard music, Officer Santos wrote, then music was almost certainly being played somewhere, even if its source remained unclear. Sarah found herself thinking about Mrs. Kowalski standing in her backyard at nearly midnight, listening to music that seemed to drift from the darkness like a message from somewhere else. Perhaps her husband had enjoyed listening to the radio in the evenings, had kept a small transistor radio on the back porch where he could sit and listen to baseball, games, or late-night talk shows while watching the stars appear above the familiar neighborhood where they had built their life together. Perhaps the music Mrs. Kowalski heard was simply memory made audible, the sound of contentment from earlier years, when the house held 2 people instead of 1, and the silence was never quite so complete. But Officer Santos had taken the report seriously, had treated Mrs. Kowalski's concern with the same professional attention given to every call that came in during the night shift. The case remained officially unsolved, filed away with a recommendation to follow up if similar complaints were received from the same area. No such complaints were ever filed, though Sarah wondered if Mrs. Kowalski continued to hear the music on other nights, if she eventually stopped calling the police and simply learned to listen to whatever song seemed to play in the darkness behind her house. As the hours passed in the basement archive, Sarah began to understand that she was experiencing something like meditation. The steady rhythm of opening folders, reading reports, and carefully returning them to their proper places created a kind of trance state that she had never found in active police work. There was no urgency here, no need to solve cases or pursue leads or make arrests. The crimes and mysteries documented in these files had already been investigated as thoroughly as possible. The reports had been written, the evidence collected, the witnesses interviewed. What remained was simply the story itself, preserved in carbon copies and typewritten forms that captured moments of human confusion and professional dedication with equal precision. Case number 1994-81467. A. Break-in reported at the Riverside Elementary School. Discovered by the custodian, Mr. Frank Chun. When he arrived for his Monday morning shift, someone had entered the building over the weekend, but nothing appeared to be missing from the classrooms or offices. The intruder had apparently spent time in the school library, where several books had been removed from their shelves and stacked neatly on the reading tables. The books were all from the children's section: picture books about animals, simple chapter books for beginning readers, a few collections of fairy tales with colorful illustrations. Officer Robert Garcia had photographed the scene, had dusted for fingerprints on the library tables and book covers, had interviewed Mr. Chun about his security procedures and weekend schedule. The custodian explained that he had locked all the doors carefully on Friday afternoon, had checked each entrance twice as he did every weekend, had set the alarm system that would alert the security company if anyone attempted to enter the building. But the alarm had never sounded, and the doors showed no signs of forced entry. The books left on the tables included The Story of Ferdinand, about a bull who preferred sitting quietly under a tree to fighting in the arena. Where the Wild Things Are, about a boy who traveled to an island populated by creatures who made him their king. The Giving Tree, about a tree who loved the boy so much that she gave him everything she had, year after year, until only a stump remained for him to sit on when he grew old and tired. Sarah imagined someone sitting alone in the elementary school library during the weekend, reading these stories by the light filtering through the tall windows that looked out onto the playground. Perhaps it was someone who had attended the school decades earlier, who remembered these same books from their own childhood, who had returned to find comfort in familiar stories about kindness and imagination and the complicated relationships between people and the world around them. Or perhaps it was someone who had never had the chance to read such books as a child, who had discovered them only now and wanted to experience them in the quiet space where they belonged, surrounded by the small desks and bulletin boards and artwork that reminded everyone who entered that learning could be a joyful thing. The case was never solved, though Officer Garcia's report suggested that the intruder had taken great care not to damage anything in the library. The books were returned to their proper shelves by the librarian, Mrs. Patterson, who mentioned in her statement that whoever had selected them had shown good taste and had treated them with obvious respect. The security system was examined by technicians who found it functioning perfectly, with no record of any breach or malfunction during the weekend in question. Sarah found herself hoping that whoever had spent those hours in the elementary school library had found whatever they were looking for in those carefully chosen books. She imagined them reading by the afternoon light, perhaps sitting in one of the small chairs designed for children, perhaps feeling for a moment the kind of peace that comes from being completely absorbed in a story that speaks to something essential and unchanged in the human heart. The folders continued, each one a doorway into a moment when the ordinary world had revealed its hidden strangeness. Case number 1995122890. A car found abandoned in the parking lot of St. Mary's Hospital. Its engine still running, the driver's door left open, the radio playing softly. The car belonged to Mr. James Morrison of Birch Street, who had no memory of driving to the hospital and no idea why he had left his car there. His wife, Helen Morrison, had called police when he arrived home on foot at 3 in the morning. Confused and unable to explain where he had been or how he had gotten there, Mr. Morrison told Officer Linda Thompson that he remembered going to bed at his usual time. Around 10:30, after watching the late news and checking that all the doors were locked. The next thing he could recall was walking up his own front steps 3 hours later, feeling as though he had just awakened from a deep sleep. His car keys were in his pocket, though he had no memory of taking them. His shoes showed signs of recent walking, though he couldn't remember putting them on. The hospital staff reported no unusual activity during the night shift. No one matching Mr. Morrison's description had been seen in the emergency room, the lobby, or any of the corridors accessible to the public. The security cameras showed his car arriving in the parking lot at approximately 1:15 in the morning, but the angle and lighting made it impossible to clearly identify the driver. The same cameras showed a figure walking away from the car about 10 minutes later, heading toward the street. But again, the image was too unclear for positive identification. Mr. Morrison was examined by his family physician the following day and showed no signs of medical problems that might explain his memory loss. He had no history of sleepwalking or similar episodes. His wife confirmed that he had been sleeping peacefully when she checked on him before going to bed herself, and that she had heard nothing unusual during the night. The front door was found unlocked when she got up to investigate after he returned home, though she was certain it had been secured before they went to sleep. Sarah wondered about those missing hours in Mr. Morrison's life. The gap in his memory that contained a drive through the dark city streets and a decision to leave. His car at the hospital with its engine running and its door open. Perhaps he had received some kind of call or message that had drawn him from his bed without fully waking him, had pulled him into a state where his body could act while his conscious mind remained asleep. Or perhaps he had simply needed to be somewhere else for a while, had followed some instinct or impulse that his waking mind could not understand or remember. The report concluded with a note that Mr. Morrison's physician would continue to monitor his condition and that the case would remain open pending any recurrence of similar episodes. No such episodes were ever reported, though Sarah found herself wondering if Mr. Morrison had ever returned to that hospital parking lot during his normal waking hours, had stood where his car had been found and tried to remember what had brought him there in the darkness. As she moved deeper into the archives, Sarah began to notice patterns that had nothing to do with criminal activity and everything to do with the rhythms of human loneliness and confusion. Many of the cases involved ELDERL, people reporting unusual sounds or activities that investigating officers could never quite verify. Others involved missing items that turned up in unexpected places, or familiar objects that appeared where they didn't belong, as if the city itself was slowly rearranging the pieces of people's lives in ways that no one could predict or explain. Case number 1996-51743, Mrs. Dorothy Fleming called police to report that someone had been in her garden during the night and had planted flowers in her vegetable patch. Not weeds or volunteer plants that might have grown there naturally, but carefully planted marigolds and petunias that had been arranged in neat rows between her tomato plants and green beans. The flowers were healthy and well established, as if they had been growing there for weeks, though Mrs. Fleming was certain they had not been present when she watered her garden the previous evening. Officer Michael Brady had examined the garden carefully, had noted the professional quality of the planting and the fact that someone had taken obvious care to avoid disturbing the existing vegetables. The flower plants were expensive varieties that would have cost considerable money at any garden center. The soil around them had been worked with expertise, amended with what appeared to be high quality compost and fertilizer. Mrs. Fleming explained that she had been gardening in the same spot for 30 years and had never grown flowers there, preferring to use the space for practical crops that could help feed her family. She had nothing against flowers, she told Officer Brady, but had always felt that her limited garden space should be used for vegetables that could be preserved and eaten throughout the winter months. The appearance of the flowers puzzled rather than upset her, though she was concerned that someone had entered her property without permission. the neighbors reported seeing nothing unusual during the night. The garden was visible from several surrounding houses, but the area was not well lit, and someone working quietly by moonlight might easily have gone unnoticed. Officer Brady found no footprints or other evidence that might identify the mystery gardener, though he noted that whoever had done the work possessed considerable skill and had obviously cared about the final result. Sarah imagined someone working in Mrs. Fleming's garden during the quiet hours before dawn, carefully preparing the soil and arranging the flowers with the same attention to detail that Mrs. Fleming had always given to her vegetables. Perhaps it was a neighbor who had noticed how hard she worked to maintain her garden, who had wanted to add something beautiful to the practical space where she grew food for her table. Or perhaps it was someone who understood that a garden devoted entirely to necessity might benefit from the presence of something planted purely for joy. The case was never solved, though Officer Brady's follow-up report noted that Mrs. Fleming had decided to leave the flowers where they were and had even begun to enjoy their presence among her vegetables. She told him that the marigolds seemed to be helping to keep insects away from her tomatoes, and that the bright colors of the petunias made her smile. When she came out in the morning to check on her plants, the hours passed without Sarah noticing their passage. The basement archive existed outside of normal time, illuminated by fluorescent lights that never dimmed and ventilated by air conditioning systems that maintained the same temperature 24 hours a day. The folders seemed infinite, stretching back through decades of police work that had been conducted with the same professional dedication regardless of whether the cases were ever solved or the mysteries ever explained. Case number 1997092-031, a telephone booth on Main Street began ringing at regular intervals, though the phone company had disconnected the line 6 months earlier as part of their program to remove payphones from locations where they were no longer profitable. The ringing occurred every day at exactly 4:15 in the afternoon, continuing for precisely 12 rings before stopping. Passersby often stopped to listen, and several had attempted to answer the phone, lifting the receiver only to find dead silence on the other end. Officer Jennifer Walsh had observed the phenomenon herself during a routine patrol, had confirmed that the phone line was indeed disconnected, and had contacted the phone company to request an explanation. The technician who examined the booth, Mr. Carl Rodriguez, could find no electrical source for the ringing sound. The internal mechanisms of the payphone had been disabled when the line was disconnected, and there was no power source that could have generated the sound of a telephone ringing. Several witnesses described the sound in their statements to Officer Walsh. Mrs. Sarah Kim, who worked at the dry cleaners across the street, said the ringing was identical to the sound the payphone had made when it was in service, though perhaps slightly softer, as if coming from a greater distance. Mr. Robert Chun, who managed the coffee shop next door, mentioned that customers often looked toward the phone booth when the ringing began, as if expecting someone to answer it. The ringing continued for 3 weeks after Officer Walsh filed her initial report, then stopped as suddenly as it had begun. The phone company eventually removed the booth entirely, replacing it with a small planter filled with flowers that the city maintenance department watered twice a week. But Sarah wondered about those 12 rings that had sounded every afternoon at exactly 4:15, calling to someone who could never answer, carrying a message that no one would ever receive. Perhaps the ringing had been a memory somehow preserved in the metal and plastic of the phone booth, an echo of all the conversations that had taken place there over the years, when people had dropped quarters into the slot and dialed numbers that connected them to voices they needed to hear. Or perhaps it was simply the city's way of mourning the loss of something that had once served an important purpose, a daily reminder that connection and communication were precious things that should not be abandoned lightly. As Sarah continued through the files, She began to understand that the basement archive contained more than just police reports. It held the city's collection of unanswered questions, its catalog of moments when the ordinary world had revealed itself to be far stranger and more mysterious than anyone expected. The officers who had investigated these cases had approached them with the same professional seriousness they brought to more conventional crimes, had gathered evidence and interviewed witnesses and filed detailed reports that treated every unusual occurrence as worthy of careful attention. Case number 1998-31205. The public library reported that someone was leaving books on the return shelf after hours. Though the building was locked and the alarm system showed no signs of intrusion, the books were not from the library's collection, but were related to subjects that patrons had recently requested through the interlibrary loan system. A patron who had requested information about beekeeping found a comprehensive guide to hive management waiting on the return shelf. Someone who had asked for help finding resources about local history discovered a detailed account of the city's founding that contained information not available in any of the library's existing materials. The head librarian, Miss Patricia Johnson, told Officer Daniel Kim that the mysterious book donations had been occurring for approximately 2 months. The books were always in excellent condition, often appeared to be recent publications, and were invariably relevant to current patron interests in ways that seemed impossible to explain as coincidence. She had attempted to stay in the building after closing time to observe the return area, but had seen nothing unusual during her vigil. Officer Kim had examined the library's security system with a technician from the alarm company, had confirmed that all doors and windows were properly secured, and had found no way that someone could have entered the building without triggering multiple alarms. The return shelf was visible from the street through the library's front windows, but the angle of view would not have allowed someone outside to see what books patrons were requesting or what subjects they were researching. Ms. Johnson mentioned in her statement that the anonymous book donor seemed to possess an almost supernatural knowledge of patron needs, often providing resources that were more helpful than anything the library's own collection could offer. She had begun to look forward to discovering what new materials might appear overnight, though she remained puzzled by the method of delivery and the identity of the person who seemed so dedicated to helping library patrons find the information they sought. Sarah imagined someone spending their evenings researching the needs of library patrons, perhaps sitting in the reading room during regular hours and observing what people were looking for, then going home to search their own extensive collection for books that might help. Perhaps it was a retired librarian who missed the satisfaction of connecting people with exactly the right resource, or a book lover who had accumulated more volumes than they could ever read and wanted to share them with people who would appreciate their value. The mysterious book donations continued for several more months, then gradually ceased as quietly as they had begun. Ms. Johnson's follow-up report noted that patrons continued to ask about the anonymous donor, hoping that the helpful book fairy might return with new treasures for the return shelf. The deeper Sarah ventured into the archives, the more she felt that she was exploring not just the city's criminal history, but its spiritual geography. These cases represented moments when the boundary between the known and unknown had become permeable, when ordinary people had encountered something that did not fit into their understanding of how the world worked. The police officers who had responded to these calls had done their best to apply logic and procedure to situations that seemed to exist outside the normal rules of cause and effect. Case number 1999-7-1834. Mr. Thomas Anderson reported that his late father's tools had been rearranged in the garage, organized according to a system that his father had used decades earlier, but that Mr. Anderson had never seen implemented. The tools had been cleaned and sharpened, and several that had been broken or rusted were now in perfect working. Condition: Mr. Anderson lived alone and had not given anyone permission to enter the garage or work on the tools. Officer Lisa Martinez found the garage meticulously organized, with every tool in its proper place, according to what appeared to be a professional system for workshop management. The tools showed signs of recent maintenance and care, though Mr. Anderson insisted that he had neither the knowledge nor the inclination to restore them to their current condition. He explained that his father had been a carpenter who took great pride in maintaining his equipment, but that he himself had never learned those skills and rarely used the tools for anything more complicated than basic household repairs. The garage showed no signs of forced entry. The doors were equipped with locks that Mr. Anderson checked regularly, and the windows were too small and too high to provide access for an adult intruder. The neighbors reported seeing nothing unusual, though Mrs. Helen Foster from the house next door mentioned that she had occasionally heard sounds from the garage during the early morning hours, as if someone were working quietly with hand tools. Mr. Anderson told Officer Martinez that he had been meaning to clean out the garage and dispose of his father's tools, which he considered too painful a reminder of his loss. His father had died 2 years earlier after a long illness, and Mr. Anderson had avoided the garage since the funeral, unable to face the accumulated equipment of a lifetime devoted to craftsmanship and precision. Now the tools seemed to be calling him back, restored to the condition his father would have maintained, organized according to the system his father had perfected over decades of professional work. Sarah wondered if love could somehow persist in the physical world, if the care and attention that Mr. Anderson's father had devoted to his tools could continue to manifest even after death. Perhaps the garage held not just equipment but memory, not just metal and wood, but the accumulated knowledge of someone who had understood that good work required good tools and that good tools deserved respectful maintenance. The restoration of the workshop might have been a final gift, a way of showing that the skills and values of one generation could be preserved and passed on even when the person who embodied them was no longer present to teach them directly. The case remained officially unsolved, though Officer Martinez's follow-up report noted that Mr. Anderson had decided to keep the tools and had even begun to use them for small projects around the house. He told her that working with his father's equipment made him feel connected to something larger than himself, as if he were learning skills that had been waiting for him to discover them. As the night wore on in the basement archive, Sarah began to feel that she was participating in a kind of communion with the city's hidden life. Each folder she opened revealed another layer of mystery, another moment when the ordinary world had shown itself to be far more complex and meaningful than most people ever realized. The police officers who had investigated these cases had served not just as law enforcement officials, but as witnesses to the sacred, as record keepers for experiences that transcended the boundaries of conventional understanding. Case number 2011-2156. The Riverside Cemetery reported that fresh flowers were appearing on graves throughout the grounds, though the groundskeeper, Mr. Frank Lopez, had no knowledge of who was placing them there. The flowers were not the typical arrangements purchased from florists, but were wildflowers and garden varieties that seemed to have been picked fresh from fields or home gardens. They appeared overnight, usually on graves that had not received visitors for many years, and were always arranged with obvious care and respect. Officer Carol Thompson had walked through the cemetery with Mr. Lopez, had observed the flower arrangements on more than 30 graves, and had noted that whoever was placing them possessed considerable knowledge of the people buried there. The flowers seemed to reflect the personalities or interests of the deceased. Roses on the grave of a woman who had been known for her garden. Wildflowers on the grave of a man who had loved hiking in the mountains. Simple daisies on the grave of a child who had died young. Mr. Lopez explained that the cemetery had been established in 1892 and contained the graves of many of the city's founding families. as well as more recent burials of people who had lived ordinary lives and were remembered, now only by their families and a few close friends. Some of the graves had not received flowers in decades, though the mysterious floral arrangement suggested that someone was keeping track of the anniversaries and remembering the people who lay buried beneath the weathered headstones. The cemeteries. Security was minimal, consisting mainly of a low fence and gates that were locked at sunset. But the grounds were large and contained many mature trees that would have provided cover for someone working quietly by moonlight. Officer Thompson found no footprints or other evidence that might identify the person who was tending to the forgotten graves, though she noted that whoever was doing the work possessed obvious respect for the dead and genuine knowledge of their individual stories. Sarah imagined someone walking through the cemetery in the early morning hours, carrying armloads of flowers picked from gardens and fields around the city, stopping at each grave to read the names and dates and remember the lives they represented. Perhaps it was someone who had lost a loved one buried in the same cemetery and who understood that grief shared was grief diminished, that flowers placed with love and respect could honor not just individual dead, but the universal human experience of loss and remembrance. The mysterious flower arrangements continued to appear for almost a year, then gradually became less frequent before stopping entirely. Mr. Lopez's final report noted that many family members had commented on the flowers during their visits, often assuming that other relatives had placed them there. The arrangements had brought comfort to people who had not expected to find such thoughtful remembrance of their loved ones, and had reminded everyone who visited the cemetery that even the dead could receive gifts from strangers who cared about, maintaining the connections between the living and those who had gone before them. The folders seemed to contain an infinite number of such stories, each one a testament to the city's hidden life of mystery and meaning. Sarah understood now that she had stumbled upon something far more valuable than a simple archive of police reports. She had discovered the city's collection of miracles, its carefully documented proof that the world contained more love and mystery and unexplained kindness than most people ever realized. Case number 2001-040923. Mrs. Margaret Sullivan reported that someone had been reading to her husband during visiting hours at the Sunset Nursing Home. Though she had not arranged for any such service, and the nursing home staff had no knowledge of the reader's identity. Her husband, Mr. Robert Sullivan, had been in the late stages of Alzheimer's disease and had not recognized family members or responded to conversation for more than 6 months. But on several occasions, Mrs. Sullivan had arrived for her regular visit to find her husband sitting peacefully while a woman read aloud from books that had been his favorites during their long marriage. Officer Mark Chun had interviewed the nursing home staff, who confirmed that an unidentified woman had been seen in Mr. Sullivan's room during regular visiting hours. She appeared to be middle-aged, was always well-dressed and polite, and seemed to have an extensive knowledge of Mr. Sullivan's literary preferences. She read from classics like Dickens and Hemingway, from history books about the Civil War and World War II, and from collections of poetry that had been popular during the 1940s and 1950s. The nursing home sign-in log contained no record of the mystery reader, though the staff acknowledged that the system was not foolproof and that someone could potentially enter and leave without signing in if they were careful about timing their visits. The woman never spoke to staff members or other visitors, focusing entirely on her reading to Mr. Sullivan, who seemed to listen with an attention and peace that his family had not seen in many months. Mrs. Sullivan told Officer Chun that she was grateful rather than concerned about the mystery reader's presence. Her husband seemed calmer and more content after the reading sessions, and she had begun to time her own visits to coincide with the woman's schedule, hoping to thank her for the kindness she was showing to a man who could no longer express his own appreciation. But the mystery reader proved elusive, seeming to sense when she might encounter family members and adjusting her schedule accordingly. Mrs. Sullivan caught glimpses of her leaving the building, always alone, always moving with the purposeful stride of someone who had accomplished something important and was ready to move on to the next task that demanded her attention. Sarah wondered about the woman who had chosen to spend her time reading to a stranger, who had somehow learned about Mr. Sullivan's literary interests and had committed herself to providing him with the comfort of familiar words, even though he could not acknowledge her presence or express his gratitude. The mystery reader continued her visits for 3 more weeks, then disappeared as quietly as she had arrived. Mr. Sullivan passed away peacefully 2 days after her final visit, and Mrs. Sullivan told Officer Chun that she believed her husband had been waiting to hear the end of whatever story the woman had been reading to him. The basement archive held thousands more folders, each one containing another piece of the city's hidden story. Another moment when ordinary life had revealed its extraordinary depths. Sarah understood now that she had discovered something precious, a collection of evidence that the world was far more mysterious and meaningful than most people ever realized. That love and kindness operated according to laws that could not be measured or explained, and that the darkness held not just secrets and crimes, but also miracles that bloomed like flowers in the spaces between what could be proven and what could be known. The fluorescent lights hummed their steady lullaby above the endless rows of filing cabinets, and Sarah closed the folder she had been reading, placed it carefully back in its proper position, and reached for the next one, ready to discover whatever story waited to be remembered in the accumulated silence of the city's dreams. The forms themselves had a poetry that Detective Sarah Chun had never noticed during her years of active duty. Each police report followed the same structure, the same careful progression from initial observation to final disposition. Yet within that rigid framework lived stories that no standardized format could truly contain. The paper was always the same pale yellow, the typeface consistent across decades, despite changes in equipment and technology. The spacing uniform, whether the report had been typed on a manual typewriter in 1975 or printed from a computer terminal in 1995. In her 3rd month exploring the basement archive, Sarah had begun to appreciate the reports not just for their content, but for their form. The way they transformed human confusion and mystery into something that could be filed, referenced, and preserved. Each report was an attempt to impose order on chaos, to translate the inexplicable into language that could be processed by a system designed to handle facts and evidence and logical conclusions. Case number 1983-061447 began like all the others. On the above date and time, this officer responded to a call regarding suspicious activity at 1247 Maple Street. Officer Janet Wilson had typed those words on her IBM Selectric, the letters striking the paper with mechanical precision that somehow made even the most unusual circumstances seem manageable, reducible to statements that could be verified and filed away. The suspicious activity in question involved Mrs. Rose Martinez, age 67, who had called police to report that someone was painting her house during the night. Not vandalism or graffiti, she explained to Officer Wilson, but careful, professional painting that was improving the appearance of her property without her knowledge or consent. When she went to bed each evening, her house looked the same as it had for the previous 15 years, weathered white siding that she had long intended to refresh, but could not afford to have painted professionally. When she woke each morning, another section of the house showed fresh paint, applied with obvious skill and attention to detail. Officer Wilson had examined the painted areas, had noted the high quality of the work and the fact that whoever was doing it had taken care to protect the landscaping and had cleaned up completely after each night's work. The paint was expensive exterior latex, applied in thin, even coats that would provide maximum protection from weather and time. The painter had even taken care to scrape and sand areas where the old paint was peeling, ensuring that the new finish would adhere properly and last for many years. Mrs. Martinez explained that she was a widow living on a fixed income, that she had been quoted prices for professional painting that exceeded her entire yearly budget for home maintenance, and that she had resigned herself to living with the deteriorating appearance of her house until she could save enough money to have the work done properly. The mysterious painter seemed to understand her situation and to have decided that her house deserved better treatment than her finances would allow. The report continued with Officer Wilson's methodical documentation of every detail that might provide a clue to the painter's identity. She had canvassed the neighborhood, had interviewed residents who might have seen someone working on the house during nighttime hours, had checked with local paint stores to see if anyone had made unusually large purchases of the specific type and color of paint being used. Each lead was carefully followed up, each potential witness interviewed with the same thorough attention that would have been given to a major criminal investigation. But the mystery painter proved as elusive as smoke, leaving behind only evidence of careful work and genuine concern for Mrs. Martinez's property. The neighbors had heard nothing unusual during the nights when the painting occurred. The paint stores had no record of recent large purchases by anyone matching the description of potential suspects. Even the paint cans left no useful clues, having been disposed of so completely that Officer Wilson could find no trace of them in the area. The report concluded with Officer Wilson's recommendation that the case remain open, pending further developments, though she noted that Mrs. Martinez had expressed gratitude rather than concern about the unauthorized improvements to her property. The painting continued for 2 more weeks, covering the entire house with professional skill and obvious care, then stopped as mysteriously as it had begun. Mrs. Martinez never learned the identity of her benefactor, but Officer Wilson's follow-up report noted that the woman's house had become one of the most attractive properties on her street, a transformation that had improved not just her own living situation, but the appearance of the entire neighborhood. Sarah found herself thinking about the hours that anonymous painter had spent working in the darkness, moving quietly around Mrs. Martinez's house with brushes and rollers and the kind of professional equipment that represented a significant investment in quality tools. Perhaps it was someone in the painting trade who understood that good work was its own reward, who took satisfaction in transforming a neglected property into something that would make its owner proud. Or perhaps it was simply someone who believed that everyone deserved to live in a house that looked cared for, regardless of their financial circumstances. The reports from that era all followed the same careful format, but within their standardized structure lived stories that revealed the hidden generosity of a community that looked after its own in ways that could not be mandated by law or regulation. Case number 1984112203 documented another act of anonymous kindness that Officer Michael Santos had investigated with the same professional thoroughness that he brought to more conventional crimes. Mr. James Peterson had reported that someone was maintaining his lawn and garden while he recovered from surgery that had left him temporarily unable to perform the physical work that keeping his property required. Not just mowing the grass, he explained to Officer Santos, but weeding the flower beds, trimming the hedges, and performing the kind of detailed maintenance that demonstrated genuine knowledge of horticulture and landscape care. The work was being done during daylight hours while Mr. Peterson was at his physical therapy appointments. But despite the public nature of the activity, none of the neighbors could provide a description of the person responsible. They had seen someone working in the yard, but their recollections were vague and contradictory, as if the mysterious groundskeeper possessed some quality that made them difficult to observe or remember clearly. Officer Santos had interviewed Mr. Peterson's regular lawn service, but they had no knowledge of anyone else working on the property and had actually been surprised by the improved condition of the landscaping when they arrived for their scheduled visits. The flower beds were weed-free, the hedges were trimmed with professional precision, and the lawn showed signs of care that went beyond simple mowing to include proper fertilization and pest control. Mr. Peterson told Officer Santos that he had always taken great pride in his yard, that maintaining his property to high standards had been one of his primary sources of satisfaction since his retirement 5 years earlier. The surgery had left him feeling helpless and frustrated, unable to perform the work that had given structure and meaning to his days. The mysterious groundskeeper seemed to understand not just what needed to be done, but why it mattered, preserving not just the appearance of Mr. Peterson's property, but his sense of dignity and connection to the place. He had worked so hard to make beautiful. The anonymous maintenance continued throughout Mr. Peterson's recovery period, then gradually ceased as he regained his strength and ability to resume his own yard work. Officer Santos's final report noted that Mr. Peterson had never learned the identity of his helper, but that the experience had given him a new appreciation for the kindness of strangers and had inspired him to look for ways to help others who might be facing similar challenges. Sarah understood that these reports represented more than just police work. They were documentation of a community's soul, evidence that people cared for each other in ways that could not be legislated or enforced, but that emerged naturally from human decency and mutual concern. The officers who had investigated these cases had treated them with the same seriousness they brought to more conventional crimes, recognizing that kindness could be as mysterious as malice and that both deserved careful attention from those charged with understanding how people behaved when they thought no one was watching. Case number 1985030678 involved Mrs. Helen Foster, who had called police to report that someone was leaving prepared meals on her doorstep several times each week. Not random food or leftovers, she explained to Officer Patricia Kim, but complete, nutritious meals that seemed to be prepared specifically for her dietary needs and preferences. The meals appeared in covered dishes that were always clean and well presented, accompanied by handwritten notes that provided heating instructions and suggestions for side dishes that would complement the main course. Officer Kim had examined the meals and the dishes they came in, had noted the high quality of the cooking and the obvious care that had gone into their preparation. The handwriting on the instruction notes was neat and feminine, though attempts to trace the paper and pen used in the notes proved unsuccessful. The dishes were common varieties that could have been purchased at any department store, offering no clues to their owner's identity. Mrs. Foster explained that she was 83 years old, that she lived alone since her husband's death 2 years earlier, and that she had been finding it increasingly difficult to maintain proper nutrition since her arthritis had made cooking painful and exhausting. She had been considering moving to an assisted living facility, not because she needed help with most daily activities, but simply because she could no longer manage the planning and preparation that good nutrition required. The mysterious meal provider seemed to understand her situation perfectly, delivering foods that were easy for arthritic hands to manage, prepared in ways that maximize nutrition while remaining appealing to an older person's sometimes diminished appetite. The meals included comfort foods that Mrs. Foster remembered from her childhood, as well as newer dishes that introduced her to flavors and cuisines she had never had the opportunity to try during her long marriage to a man who preferred simple, traditional cooking. Officer Kim had attempted to stake out Mrs. Foster's house during the times when meals typically appeared, but the meal provider proved as elusive as the other anonymous benefactors she had encountered in her years of police work. The meals simply appeared, as if materialized from goodwill and concern, leaving behind only the evidence of their careful preparation and the grateful appreciation of a woman who had been struggling to maintain her independence. Report documented Officer Kim's investigation with the same methodical attention to detail that characterized all the reports from that era. But between the lines of official language lived a recognition that some mysteries were more beautiful than they were problematic. Mrs. Foster never learned who was providing her meals, but Officer Kim's follow-up reports noted that the woman had been able to remain in her own home and that her health had improved significantly during the months when the anonymous meals appeared regularly on her doorstep. Sarah found herself imagining the person who had taken responsibility for Mrs. Foster's nutrition, who had spent hours each week planning, shopping for, and preparing meals for someone they might never meet face to face. Perhaps it was another neighbor who understood what it meant to age alone, who remembered their own parents or grandparents facing similar challenges and had decided to act on the knowledge that small kindnesses could make the difference between independence and institutionalization. Reports continued to reveal the same patterns of anonymous generosity, documented with police precision but clearly representing something that transcended law enforcement and entered the realm of community care. Case number 1986-8-1934 described the experience of Mr. Robert Chun, who had contacted police to report that someone was providing transportation for his elderly mother to her medical appointments. Though neither he nor his mother had arranged for such a service, Mrs. Lucy Chen, age 79, had been scheduled for a series of appointments with specialists at the downtown medical center. Visits that were necessary but difficult to manage since Mr. Chun's work schedule conflicted with the appointment times, and his mother no longer felt safe driving in heavy traffic. They had been trying to coordinate family schedules and considering hiring a private driver when Mrs. Chun began reporting that someone was picking her up for her appointments and bringing her home safely afterward. Officer Daniel Rodriguez had interviewed Mrs. Chun, who described her mysterious driver as a pleasant middle-aged woman who drove a clean, comfortable sedan and who seemed to know exactly where each appointment was located within the complex medical center. The driver was always punctual, never charged any fee for her services, and seemed genuinely interested in ensuring that Mrs. Chun received the medical care she needed. The driver never provided her name or contact information, though she seemed to know Mrs. Chun's appointment schedule better than the family did themselves. She would arrive exactly when needed, would wait patiently during appointments that sometimes ran longer than expected, and would help Mrs. Ching navigate the confusing corridors and elevator systems of the medical center with the expertise of someone who had spent considerable time in such facilities. That Mrs. Chun told Officer Rodriguez that she felt safe and comfortable with her anonymous driver, that the woman was respectful and kind, and that she seemed to understand the anxiety that medical appointments could create for elderly patients. The driver would engage in gentle conversation during the rides, asking about Mrs. Chun's garden or her grandchildren, but never pressing for personal information or making Mrs. Chun feel obligated to share more than she was comfortable discussing. Officer Rodriguez had attempted to identify the mysterious driver by contacting the medical center's patient transport services, but they had no record of providing rides for Mrs. Chun and no knowledge of any informal transport arrangements. The security staff had noticed an unidentified woman helping elderly patients navigate the facility, but their descriptions were too general to be useful for identification purposes. The transportation service continued for 6 months, covering all of Mrs. Chun's necessary medical appointments, and even including a few trips to the pharmacy and grocery store that made it easier for her to maintain her independence. The service ended gradually, with fewer rides offered as Mrs. Chun's medical situation stabilized and her need for frequent appointments decreased. Sarah wondered about the woman who had taken it upon herself to provide transportation for elderly strangers, who had somehow learned about Mrs. Chun's situation and had committed her time and resources to ensuring that age and circumstance did not prevent someone from receiving necessary medical care. Perhaps she was someone who had faced similar challenges with her own elderly relatives, who understood the complexity and stress of coordinating medical care for people who could no longer manage such arrangements independently. The reports from this period all shared a common thread. They documented a community that functioned according to unwritten rules of mutual support, where people looked after each other in ways that required no formal organization or official recognition. The police officers who investigated these cases had approached them with the same professional diligence they brought to criminal investigations, recognizing that unexplained kindness deserved the same careful attention as unexplained malice. Case number 19871204445 involved the Washington Elementary School, where the principal, Mrs. Dorothy Martinez, had called police to report that someone was anonymously paying the lunch fees for students whose families were behind on their accounts. Not a lump sum payment that would have been easy to trace, she explained to Officer Sharon Wilson, but individual payments that appeared to be made with detailed knowledge of each student's specific situation and financial need. The payments were made in cash, left in the school's main office mailbox overnight with handwritten notes that identified exactly which student accounts should be credited and in what amounts. The handwriting was neat and careful, the notes were always polite and respectful, and the amounts were always precisely what was needed to bring each student's account into good standing without creating any excess credit that might draw unwelcome attention. Officer Wilson had reviewed the school's lunch program records, had noted the pattern of anonymous payments that had been occurring for approximately 3 months, and had interviewed school staff about possible suspects. The payments demonstrated intimate knowledge of which students qualified for reduced-price meals, which families were experiencing temporary financial difficulties, and which children might be going without lunch. Rather than accepting the stigma of having their accounts marked as delinquent. Mrs. Martinez explained to Officer Wilson that the anonymous benefactor seemed to understand not just the financial aspects of the situation, but the emotional impact on children who were singled out for having unpaid lunch accounts. The payments were timed to prevent students from being denied meals or marked as delinquent, preserving their dignity while ensuring that they received proper nutrition during the school day. The school had attempted to identify the anonymous donor by installing a camera focused on the mailbox, but the payments continued to appear without any useful footage of the person making them. The donor seemed to possess almost supernatural knowledge of the camera's location and timing, managing to make payments during the brief periods when the system was not recording or when the angle did not provide a clear view of the mailbox area. Officer Wilson's investigation revealed no obvious suspects among the school staff, parent volunteers, or community members who might have had access to the detailed information about student lunch accounts that the anonymous donor clearly possessed. The payments continued throughout the remainder of the school year, ensuring that no student went hungry because of their family's financial circumstances, then ceased during the summer break, as would be expected when the lunch program was not in operation. Sarah imagined someone spending their evenings reviewing the school's lunch account records, calculating exactly how much each struggling family owed, and then making cash payments that would resolve the debts without creating any embarrassment or unwanted attention for the children involved. Perhaps it was a teacher or staff member who understood the impact that unpaid lunch debts could have on student self-esteem and academic performance. Or perhaps it was a community member who remembered being hungry as a child and had decided that no student in their community should face that experience. The anonymous payments resumed when school started again in the fall, continuing the pattern of precise targeted assistance that kept students fed while preserving their dignity. Officer Wilson's follow-up reports documented the ongoing mystery, but also noted the positive impact the payments had on student welfare and the school's ability to focus on education rather than debt collection. Reports continued to reveal the same themes: communities that functioned according to principles of mutual care, police officers who took seriously their role as documenters of human behavior, and anonymous benefactors who seemed to possess almost mystical knowledge of their neighbors' needs and circumstances. Case number 1-988052167 described the situation at Riverside Pharmacy, where the owner, Mr. Carl Thompson, had contacted police to report that someone was anonymously paying for prescription medications for elderly customers who were struggling to afford their required treatments. Officer Maria Santos had interviewed Mr. Thompson, who explained that the payments had been occurring for approximately 2 months and always involved medications that were essential for managing chronic conditions like diabetes, heart disease, and high blood pressure. The payments were made in cash, left in sealed envelopes that identified the specific customers and prescriptions to be covered, and always included exact amounts with no overpayment. That might have made it possible to trace the source through change transactions. The anonymous benefactor demonstrated detailed knowledge of which customers were having difficulty affording their medications, which prescriptions were most critical for maintaining health, and which patients might be skipping doses or rationing pills to make their supplies last longer. The payments prevented elderly customers from having to choose between medication and other necessities like food or utilities, ensuring that they could maintain their health while preserving their pride and privacy. Mr. Thompson told Officer Santos that he had been concerned about several elderly customers who had been picking up only partial prescription fills or who had been stretching their medications beyond safe limits because of financial constraints. He had been considering implementing some kind of assistance program himself, but the anonymous benefactor had solved the problem more effectively than any formal program could have managed. Officer Santos had attempted to identify the mysterious donor by examining the envelopes and notes, by reviewing the pharmacy's security footage, and by interviewing customers who might have observed someone making payments. But the donor proved as elusive as the other anonymous benefactors documented in the archive, leaving behind only evidence of their generosity and the grateful relief of elderly customers who could afford to maintain their health. The payments continued for more than a year, covering hundreds of prescriptions for dozens of elderly customers who might otherwise have been forced to choose between medication and other basic needs. Mr. Thompson's follow-up reports noted that several customers had experienced significant improvements in their health outcomes during the period when their medications were consistently covered, suggesting that the anonymous donor had quite literally saved lives through their generosity. Sarah understood that these reports documented something precious and rare: a community where people truly took care of each other, where anonymous generosity flowed like an underground river, surfacing in moments of need to provide exactly the help that was required without any expectation of recognition or reward. The police officers who had investigated these cases had treated them with the same seriousness and professionalism that they brought to criminal investigations, recognizing that unexplained kindness was as worthy of documentation as unexplained malice. The reports continued, each one adding another layer to Sarah's understanding of the community that had existed in earlier decades, when people seemed to know their neighbors' needs and to feel responsible for addressing them in practical, effective ways. Case number 1-989091523 involved the downtown branch of the public library, where the head librarian, Mr. James Kim, had called police to report that someone was anonymously donating books that exactly matched patron requests and research needs. Officer Jennifer Martinez had examined the donated books, which appeared overnight on the library's return counter, despite the building being locked and secured. The books were always in excellent condition, often seemed to be recent publications that would have been expensive to purchase, and invariably related to subjects that patrons had recently requested through the library's research assistance program. Mr. Kim explained to Officer Martinez that the anonymous donor seemed to possess supernatural knowledge of patron needs, often providing resources that were more comprehensive and current than anything the library's existing collection could offer. A patron researching local genealogy would find a detailed family history that included information not available in any other source. Someone working on a school project about environmental science would discover a recently published textbook that covered their topic in perfect detail. The donated books created a unique challenge for the library staff, who were uncertain about how to process materials that had not been formally acquired. Through normal channels, Mr. Kim had decided to treat the donations as temporary loans, cataloging them in a special collection that could be accessed by patrons, but that would not become permanent additions to the library's holdings until the donor's identity and intentions could be determined. Officer Martinez had attempted to solve the mystery through conventional investigative techniques, but the anonymous donor proved as elusive as others documented in the archive. Security cameras revealed nothing useful. The building's locks and alarm system showed no signs of intrusion, and interviews with library staff and regular patrons provided no useful leads. The book donations continued throughout the academic year, providing resources that enhanced the library's ability to serve patron needs in ways that would have required significant budget increases if the materials had been purchased through normal acquisition channels. Mr. Kim's follow-up reports noted that patron satisfaction had increased dramatically during the period when the mysterious donations were occurring, suggesting that the anonymous donor was performing a genuine public service that benefited the entire community. Sarah found herself thinking about the person who had taken such care to understand what library patrons needed, who had spent their own money to purchase books that would help students complete research projects and adults pursue their intellectual interests. Perhaps it was a retired librarian who missed the satisfaction of connecting people with exactly the right resource. Or perhaps it was simply someone who understood that access to information was a fundamental requirement for education and personal growth. The donated books represented more than just generosity. They represented a deep understanding of how learning happens, how curiosity develops, and how access to the right resources at the right moment can transform someone's understanding of a subject or inspire them to pursue knowledge in new directions. The anonymous donor had created a kind of educational magic, providing exactly what was needed when it was needed most. The reports from this era all shared the same qualities: careful documentation of mysterious generosity, professional investigation that treated kindness as seriously as crime, and recognition that communities could function according to principles of mutual support that operated outside formal institutions and official programs. The police officers who had written these reports had understood that their role extended beyond law enforcement to include witnessing and recording the full spectrum of human behavior, including acts of anonymous kindness that revealed the best aspects of community life. Case number 199-007-0892 documented the experience of several families in the Riverside neighborhood, where someone was anonymously providing childcare during family emergencies without any advance arrangement or request for such services. Officer Robert Chun had investigated reports from parents who had discovered that their children were being safely cared for during medical emergencies, family crises, or other situations where normal childcare arrangements had fallen through. The anonymous caregiver seemed to possess remarkable knowledge of when families were facing difficulties, appearing at exactly the right moment to ensure that children were supervised and cared for while parents dealt with emergency situations. The caregiver was described as a middle-aged woman who was gentle and competent with children, who seemed to know each child's individual needs and preferences, and who never asked for payment or recognition for her services. Officer Chun had interviewed several families who had benefited from the mysterious child care services, all of whom described similar experiences. The caregiver would arrive shortly after a family crisis began, would calmly take charge of the children, and would provide age-appropriate care that kept the children safe and comfortable while their parents focused on handling whatever emergency had arisen. The children themselves provided the most detailed descriptions of their anonymous caregiver, though their accounts varied in ways that suggested either multiple caregivers or someone who was remarkably skilled at adapting her appearance and approach to match each child's expectations and comfort level. Some children described her as grandmotherly, others as more like a favorite aunt, but all agreed that she made them feel safe and cared for during stressful times when their normal routines had been disrupted. Officer Chun's investigation revealed no formal child care services that could account for the anonymous caregiver's appearances, no neighborhood networks that had been organized to provide emergency assistance, and no obvious candidates among the family's friends or extended relatives who might have been providing such services without acknowledgement. The emergency childcare continued for approximately 18 months, providing assistance to more than a dozen families during various crises and emergencies. The service ended gradually, with fewer appearances as time went on, suggesting either that the caregiver had moved away or that the families in the neighborhood had developed more stable support networks that reduced their need for emergency assistance. Sarah imagined someone who had dedicated herself to ensuring that children were never left without proper care during family emergencies, who had somehow developed the ability to sense when such emergencies were occurring and to respond immediately with exactly the kind of help that was needed. Perhaps it was someone who had raised her own children and grandchildren and who understood that the most frightening aspect of any family crisis was the worry about how it would affect the children involved. The anonymous caregiver had provided more than just supervision. She had offered children the reassurance that adults could be trusted to take care of them, even during scary or confusing times, that communities included people who would step forward to help when help was needed most. Her service had allowed parents to focus on handling their emergencies while knowing that their children were safe and comfortable, reducing stress during already difficult situations and strengthening families' ability to cope with unexpected challenges. The reports continued to reveal the same patterns of anonymous assistance, each case documented with police precision, but clearly representing something that transcended conventional law enforcement and entered the realm of community care. The officers who had investigated these cases had understood that their role included witnessing and recording acts of kindness that revealed the hidden strengths of the communities they served, creating an archive of evidence that people could be trusted to care for each other in ways that required no formal organization or official oversight. As Sarah continued through the folders, she began to understand that these reports represented more than just police work. They were documentation of a social contract that operated according to principles of mutual responsibility and anonymous generosity. The community described in these reports functioned as an extended family, where people looked after each other's welfare without expecting recognition or reward, where needs were met through informal networks of care that emerged naturally from human decency and shared concern. The fluorescent lights continued their steady hum above the endless rows of filing cabinets, and Sarah reached for another folder, ready to discover whatever story of mysterious kindness or unexplained generosity waited to be remembered in the accumulated documentation of the city's hidden life. Each report was a testament to the possibility that communities could function according to higher principles than law and regulation, that people could be trusted to care for each other in ways that created safety and support without requiring formal institutions or official programs. The archive held thousands more folders, each one containing another piece of evidence that the world contained more love and mystery and unexplained kindness than most people ever realized. That the darkness held not just secrets and crimes, but also miracles that bloomed like flowers in the spaces between what could be proven and what could be known. The cabinets in the furthest reaches of the basement stretched beyond the range of the overhead fluorescent lights, disappearing into shadows that seemed to hold decades of accumulated silence. Detective Sarah Chun had been exploring these depths for weeks now, moving slowly through sections where the air grew thicker with dust, and the smell of old paper became so concentrated it felt like breathing in compressed time itself. Here, the filing system became more elaborate and more mysterious. The folders were organized not just by date and case number, but by categories that seemed to follow some internal logic that had been lost when the clerks who created it retired or passed away. There were sections marked with handwritten labels in faded ink. Unexplained disappearances, voluntary, property anomalies recurring, community assistance, anonymous, sources, and dozens of other classifications that suggested someone had spent considerable time trying to create order from the chaos of human mystery. The folders themselves were older here, the paper more brittle, the typewritten words sometimes so faded that Sarah had to hold them under her small flashlight to make out the text. These were the cases that had accumulated before anyone thought to install proper lighting in this part of the basement. Before anyone imagined that future, detectives might want to explore the deepest layers of the city's documented mysteries. She found herself drawn to a section labeled simply Archives, Indefinite, where folders seemed to contain cases that had never been officially closed but had simply drifted into a state of permanent suspension, waiting for information that would probably never come. The dust on these folders was so thick that opening them released small clouds that danced in the vase beam of her flashlight like ghosts being disturbed from their rest. Case number 1967041-203 was typed on paper that had yellowed to the color of weak tea, the words impressed into the page by a manual typewriter, whose keys had struck with enough force to leave slight indentations on the reverse side. The case involved Mrs. Eleanor Hoffman, who had called police to report that her late husband's woodworking shop was producing finished projects. Despite his death 6 months earlier, Officer Thomas Mitchell had responded to the call, had examined the workshop behind Mrs. Hoffman's house, and had found clear evidence of recent activity. A rocking chair that had been left unfinished at the time of Mr. Hoffman's death was now complete, sanded smooth and finished with the same careful attention to detail that had characterized all of her husband's work. A set of kitchen cabinets that he had planned to build for their daughter's new home sat finished and ready for installation, constructed according to the exact specifications he had discussed with the family before his illness had made work impossible. Mrs. Hoffman told Officer Mitchell that she had locked the workshop after her husband's funeral, had not given anyone permission to use his tools or complete his projects, and had no explanation for how the work was being accomplished. The workshop's door remained locked, the windows were secure, and there was no evidence of forced entry. Yet someone was clearly using the space, working with professional skill and intimate knowledge of Mr. Hoffman's techniques and standards. Officer Mitchell had examined the completed projects, had noted the quality of the craftsmanship and the fact that whoever was doing the work was using Mr. Hoffman's tools exactly as he would have used them. The wood was selected from his existing supplies, cut and joined according to his preferred methods, and finished with the same stains and sealers that he had always used for similar projects. The report continued with Officer Mitchell's methodical investigation, his interviews with neighbors who might have seen lights in the workshop during nighttime hours, his consultation with other woodworkers who might have known about Mr. Hoffman's unfinished projects and decided to complete them as a tribute to his memory. But no such explanation emerged from the investigation. And the mystery deepened as more projects appeared in the workshop over the following weeks. Mrs. Hoffman's daughter had provided Officer Mitchell with detailed descriptions of the kitchen cabinets her father had planned to build, including sketches and measurements that he had made during their conversations about her new home. The completed cabinets matched these plans perfectly, constructed with the same attention to detail and quality that had made Mr. Hoffman's work sought after throughout the community during his 40-year career as a furniture maker. Sarah found herself imagining Mr. Hoffman's workshop in the months after his death, his tools hanging in their accustomed places, his workbench covered with the accumulated dust of disuse, his unfinished projects waiting for hands that would never return to complete them. Perhaps love could somehow persist in the physical world, could continue to move through familiar spaces and work with familiar tools to finish what had been left incomplete when death interrupted the rhythm of creation. The mysterious woodworking continued for almost a year, completing every project that Mr. Hoffman had planned or started before his death. Mrs. Hoffman never learned who was responsible for the work, but Officer Mitchell's follow-up reports noted that the completed projects had provided great comfort to the family, allowing them to have the furniture that Mr. Hoffman had intended to create for them and preserving his legacy of craftsmanship for future generations. The deeper Sarah ventured into the archive, the more she understood that these oldest files contained stories that existed at the boundary between the explainable and the miraculous, cases that had challenged the officers who investigated them to expand their understanding of what was possible in the world. The dust that covered these folders seemed to be a kind of protective layer, preserving stories that might have been dismissed or forgotten if they had not been so carefully documented and filed away. Case number 1969-81456 was contained in a folder that had been sealed with tape that had grown brittle with age, cracking when Sarah carefully opened it to reveal pages that seemed to have been handled very little since they were first filed. The case involved the Riverside Cemetery, where the groundskeeper, Mr. Frank Rodriguez, had reported that fresh flowers were appearing on graves throughout the grounds with no apparent source or explanation. Officer Maria Santos had walked through the cemetery with Mr. Rodriguez, had observed the flower arrangements on more than 50 graves, and had noted that whoever was placing them possessed detailed knowledge of the people buried there. The flowers seemed to reflect the personalities and preferences of the deceased. Roses on the grave of a woman who had been known for her garden, wildflowers on the grave of a man who had loved hiking in the mountains, simple daisies on the grave of a child who had died young. The flowers were always fresh, as if they had been cut that morning, and they were arranged with obvious care and respect. But Mr. Rodriguez insisted that no one had been seen placing them, and the cemetery's simple security measures revealed no evidence of anyone entering the grounds during the nighttime hours when the arrangements typically appeared. Officer Santos had attempted to solve the mystery through conventional investigation, had interviewed family members who might have been placing flowers without mentioning it to the groundskeeper, had checked with local florists who might have been making regular deliveries to the cemetery. But the flowers were not the expensive varieties sold by commercial florists. They were garden flowers and wildflowers that seemed to have been gathered from private gardens and natural areas around the city. The report documented Officer Santos's growing sense that she was investigating something that transcended normal categories of explanation. The flower arrangements appeared with a regularity and precision that suggested careful planning, yet no amount of surveillance or investigation could identify their source. The flowers brought comfort to families who discovered them during their visits to the cemetery, yet no one could thank whoever was responsible for the kindness. Mr. Rodriguez told Officer Santos that the mysterious flower arrangements had transformed the atmosphere of the cemetery, had made it feel less like a place of endings and more like a place where love continued to bloom despite the finality of death. Visitors often assumed that other family members had placed the flowers, leading to conversations and connections between people who discovered they were not alone in their grief and remembrance. Asterisk, the flowers continued to appear for more than 2 years, brightening graves throughout the cemetery and creating a sense that the dead were still remembered and cared for by someone who understood the importance of such gestures. The mystery was never solved, but Officer Santos's final report noted that the anonymous flower provider had created something beautiful and meaningful that had enhanced the cemetery's role as a place of comfort and remembrance for the entire community. Sarah imagined someone walking through the cemetery in the early morning hours, carrying armloads of flowers gathered from gardens and fields around the city, stopping at each grave to read the names and dates and remember the lives they represented. Perhaps it was someone who had lost many people they loved, who understood that grief shared was grief lightened, who had found a way to honor not just their own dead, but all the dead who rested in that peaceful place. The dust motes continued to dance in the beam of Sarah's flashlight as she moved deeper into the archive, where the folders grew even older and the stories they contained seemed to come from a time when the boundary between the ordinary and the extraordinary was more permeable than it had become in later decades. These were cases that had been investigated by officers who seemed more willing to accept that the world contained mysteries that could not be solved through conventional means, who had documented their investigations with the same careful attention they brought to more conventional crimes, while acknowledging that some questions had no satisfactory answers. Case number 197111227 described the experience of the Washington Elementary School, where the principal, Mrs. Dorothy Chun, had called police to report that someone was leaving books in the library overnight. Books that seemed to be chosen specifically for individual students who were struggling with reading or who had expressed interest in particular subjects. Officer Daniel Kim had examined the books, which appeared on the library shelves as if they had always been part of the collection, yet were not recorded in any of the library's acquisition records. The books were always in excellent condition, often seemed to be recent publications that would have been expensive to purchase, and invariably matched the reading levels and interests of specific students in ways that seemed impossible to explain as coincidence. Mrs. Chun explained to Officer Kim that the mysterious book donations had been occurring for approximately 6 months and always seemed to anticipate student needs before they were explicitly expressed. A student who was struggling with a science project would find a book that explained the relevant concepts at exactly the right level of complexity. A child who had shown interest in astronomy would discover a beautifully illustrated guide to the constellations that captured their imagination and inspired them to learn more. The books appeared to be selected by someone with extensive knowledge of child development and education, someone who understood not just what students needed to know, but how they learned best and what kinds of materials would engage their interest while building their skills. The mysterious donor seemed to possess almost supernatural insight into each child's individual learning style and academic needs. Officer Kim had attempted to identify the anonymous book provider through conventional investigative techniques, had checked with local bookstores and publishers, had interviewed teachers and librarians who might have had access to information about student interests and reading levels. But the investigation revealed no obvious suspects, and no clear method by which someone could have gained the detailed knowledge of student needs that the book selections clearly demonstrated. Donated books created a unique challenge for the school librarian, Mrs. Patterson, who was uncertain about how to catalog materials that had not been formally acquired through normal channels. She had decided to treat the donations as temporary loans, making them available to students while attempting to determine their source and the donor's intentions. Officer Kim's investigation continued for several months, during which time the mysterious book donations continued to appear with regularity that suggested careful planning and detailed knowledge of the school's academic calendar and curriculum requirements. The books enhanced the library's ability to serve student needs in ways that would have required significant budget increases if the materials had been purchased through normal acquisition channels. The report concluded with Officer Kim's observation that the anonymous donor was providing a genuine public service that benefited not just individual students, but the entire school community. The donated books had improved reading scores, had inspired students to explore new subjects, and had created a sense that learning was valued and supported by people beyond the official school. Staff. Sarah found herself thinking about the person who had taken such care to understand what young students needed, who had spent their own money to purchase books that would help children develop their reading skills and discover new interests. Perhaps it was a retired teacher who missed the satisfaction of connecting students with exactly the right book at exactly the right moment. Or perhaps it was simply someone who understood that access to appropriate reading materials was fundamental to educational success and personal growth. The mysterious book donations represented more than just generosity. They represented a deep understanding of how learning happens, how curiosity develops, and how the right book at the right moment can transform a student's relationship with reading and learning. The anonymous donor had created a kind of educational magic that had enhanced the school's ability to serve its students in ways that transcended the limitations of official budgets and formal acquisition procedures. As Sarah continued through the folders, she began to understand that the deepest levels of the archive contained stories that challenged conventional understanding of how communities functioned and how people cared for each other. These cases had been investigated by officers who seemed more comfortable with mystery than their later counterparts, who had documented unexplained phenomena with the same professional thoroughness they brought to conventional crimes, while acknowledging that some aspects of human behavior operated according to principles that could not be easily categorized or explained. Case number 19730508834 involved the downtown branch of the public library, where the head librarian, Mr. James Thompson, had called police to report that someone was providing research assistance to library patrons during overnight hours when the building was supposedly closed and secured. Officer Jennifer Rodriguez had examined the library's security system, had confirmed that all doors and windows were properly locked during nighttime hours, and had found no evidence of unauthorized entry. Yet several patrons had reported receiving detailed research assistance from a helpful librarian who seemed to be working in the building during late evening and early morning, hours when no staff members were officially present. The mysterious librarian was described as a middle-aged woman who possessed encyclopedic knowledge of the library's collection and remarkable skill in helping patrons find exactly the resources they needed for their research projects. She seemed to have unlimited time to devote to each patron's needs, never appeared rushed or distracted, and invariably provided assistance that exceeded what patrons had expected when they began their research. Mr. Thompson told Officer Rodriguez that several patrons had mentioned their appreciation for the exceptional service they had received from the night librarian, though no such position existed and no staff members were scheduled to work during the hours when the assistance was reportedly being provided. The patrons seemed genuinely puzzled when told that the library was closed during the times when they claimed to have received help. Officer Rodriguez had interviewed several patrons who described similar experiences with the mysterious librarian. They had arrived at the library during regular hours to work on research projects, had struggled to find the resources they needed, and had returned the following day to discover that someone had left detailed research materials and bibliographies that addressed their specific needs with remarkable precision and insight. The research assistance was always provided anonymously, with materials left in places where patrons would easily find them, but with no indication of who had compiled the information or how they had gained access to the library's resources. During closed hours, the materials included not just books and articles from the library's collection, but photocopies of documents from other libraries and institutions that would have required extensive interlibrary loan requests to obtain. Through normal channels, Officer Rodriguez's investigation revealed no explanation for how someone could have gained access to the library during closed hours. No staff members who might have been providing unauthorized assistance, and no obvious method by which the research materials could have been compiled and delivered without leaving traces that would have been detected by the library's security measures. The mysterious research assistance continued for approximately 8 months, helping dozens of patrons with projects ranging from academic research to personal genealogy to business planning. The assistance was always accurate, comprehensive, and remarkably well-suited to each patron's specific needs and level of expertise. Mr. Thompson's follow-up reports noted that patron satisfaction had increased dramatically during the period when the mysterious research assistance was being provided, and that several patrons had completed projects that might otherwise have been abandoned due to the difficulty of finding appropriate resources. The night librarian, whoever she was, had provided a level of service that exceeded what the library's official staff could offer given their limited time and resources. Sarah imagined someone who had dedicated themselves to ensuring that every person who entered the library with a genuine need for information would receive the help they required, regardless of the constraints imposed by normal operating hours and staffing limitations. Perhaps it was a former librarian who had retired but could not bear to see patrons struggle with research challenges that she knew how to solve, who had found a way to continue providing the service that had given meaning to her professional life. The mysterious research assistance represented more than just exceptional service. It represented a commitment to the principle that access to information was a fundamental right that should not be limited by bureaucratic constraints or institutional limitations. The night librarian had created a kind of informational sanctuary where every question was treated as important and every seeker of knowledge was provided with the resources they needed to satisfy their curiosity or complete their work. The folders continued to reveal stories that existed at the intersection of human need and mysterious assistance. Cases that had been investigated with professional thoroughness yet had never yielded satisfactory explanations for the phenomena they documented. The officers who had written these reports seemed to understand that their role extended beyond solving mysteries to witnessing and recording acts of kindness that revealed the hidden strengths of the communities they served. Case number 1975-91445 described the situation at Riverside Pharmacy, where the owner, Mr. Carl Martinez, had contacted police to report that someone was anonymously providing medical equipment and supplies for elderly customers who could not afford to purchase the items they needed to manage their health conditions. Officer Michael Santos had examined the donated equipment, which included walkers, wheelchairs, blood pressure monitors, and various other medical devices that appeared overnight in the pharmacy storage area despite the building being locked and secured. The equipment was always in excellent condition, often appeared to be nearly new, and invariably matched the specific needs of elderly customers. who had been struggling to afford such items on their fixed incomes. The anonymous donations demonstrated detailed knowledge of which customers needed assistance, what types of equipment would best serve their individual health conditions, and how to provide help in ways that preserved the recipient's dignity and privacy. The donated items were always left with handwritten notes that identified which customers should receive them and provided instructions for their proper use and maintenance. Mr. Martinez told Officer Santos that the mysterious benefactor seemed to understand not just the financial challenges faced by elderly customers, but the emotional impact of having to choose between medical necessities and other basic needs. The donated equipment allowed customers to maintain their independence and manage their health conditions without the stress and embarrassment of having to ask for help or go without essential medical support. Officer Santos had attempted to identify the anonymous donor through conventional investigative techniques, had examined the equipment for clues about its source, had interviewed customers who might have observed someone making deliveries to the pharmacy during closed hours. But the investigation revealed no useful leads and no explanation for how someone could have gained access to the building or obtained such detailed information about customer needs. The donated medical equipment continued to appear for more than a year, helping dozens of elderly customers maintain their health and independence in ways that would not have been possible without the anonymous assistance. The donations ended gradually, with fewer items appearing as time went on, suggesting either that the donor had moved away or that the immediate needs in the community had been addressed. Mr. Martinez's follow-up reports noted that the anonymous donations had significantly improved the quality of life for many elderly customers, had reduced their need for more expensive medical interventions, and had demonstrated the positive impact that community support could have on individual health outcomes. The mysterious donor had provided more than just equipment. They had offered hope and practical assistance that had made it possible for elderly people to age with dignity in their own homes. Sarah found herself thinking about the person who had taken responsibility for ensuring that elderly members of the community had access to the medical equipment they needed, who had somehow learned about individual health conditions and financial circumstances and had responded with exactly the right kind of help. Perhaps it was someone who had cared for elderly relatives, who understood the challenges of aging and the importance of maintaining independence for as long as possible. The anonymous medical equipment donations represented more than just generosity. They represented a commitment to the principle that health care should be accessible to everyone, regardless of their financial circumstances. That aging should not mean having to choose between medical necessities and other basic needs. The mysterious donor had created a safety net that had allowed elderly people to maintain their health and independence, while preserving their dignity and privacy. As Sarah moved deeper into the oldest sections of the archive, the air grew thicker with dust and the stories grew stranger, as if she were approaching some fundamental truth about the nature of human kindness and community, care that had been obscured by the passage of time and the accumulation of more conventional explanations for how the world worked. Case number 19771222103 was contained in a folder that seemed to have been handled very little since it was first filed. The pages still crisp despite their age, the typewritten words still dark against the yellowed paper. The case involved Mrs. Agnes Kowalski, who had called police to report that someone was maintaining her late husband's garden with the same care and attention he had given it during the 43 years they had lived in their house together. Officer Patricia Wong had examined the garden, had noted the professional quality of the maintenance and the fact that whoever was doing the work possessed intimate knowledge of her husband's gardening methods and plant preferences. The vegetable garden was being managed according to the same rotation schedule he had followed for decades. The flower beds were being tended with the same attention to soil preparation and pest control that had made his garden the pride of the neighborhood. and even the compost pile was being maintained according to his precise system for creating the rich organic matter that had nourished his plants. Mrs. Kowalski told Officer Wong that she had been dreading the approach of spring because she knew she could not maintain the garden that had been her husband's greatest joy and the source of much of the fresh food that had sustained them throughout their marriage. She had been considering having the garden destroyed and the area converted to low-maintenance lawn, though the thought of eliminating her husband's life's work had filled her with sadness and guilt. The mysterious gardener seemed to understand not just the practical aspects of garden maintenance, but the emotional significance of preserving something that had been created with love and dedication over many years. The garden continued to produce the same abundance of vegetables and flowers that it had during her husband's lifetime, providing Mrs. Kowalski with fresh food and beautiful blooms that connected her to memories of the life they had shared together. Officer Wong had attempted to identify the anonymous gardener through conventional investigation, had interviewed neighbors who might have seen someone working in Mrs. Kowalski's yard, had checked with local gardening services that might have been providing pro bono assistance. But the investigation revealed no useful leads and no explanation for how someone had gained such detailed knowledge of her husband's gardening methods and seasonal schedules. The garden maintenance continued throughout the growing season and resumed the following spring, preserving not just the plants and produce that Mrs. Kowalski's husband had cultivated, but the entire ecosystem he had created through years of careful attention to soil health, beneficial insects, and companion planting. The mysterious gardener was maintaining not just a plot of land, but a living legacy that honored the knowledge and dedication of someone who had understood that gardens were about more than just growing food and flowers. Officer Wong's follow-up reports noted that Mrs. Kowalski had found great comfort in the continuation of her husband's garden, that the fresh vegetables and beautiful flowers had provided not just practical benefits but emotional healing during her first years of widowhood. The anonymous gardener had given her the gift of time, allowing her to grieve and adjust to her new circumstances while ensuring that her husband's work would not be lost. Sarah imagined someone who had understood that gardens represented more than just plants and produce, that they embodied the accumulated knowledge and care of the people who created them, that they served as living monuments to the dedication and skill of gardeners who had devoted years to understanding what each plant needed and how different species could work together to create abundance and beauty. The mysterious garden maintenance represented more than just horticultural assistance. It represented a commitment to preserving the legacy of someone whose knowledge and dedication had created something beautiful and productive that deserved to continue beyond his lifetime. The anonymous gardener had ensured that Mrs. Kowalski's husband's contribution to the neighborhood's beauty and food security would not be lost simply because death had interrupted the rhythm of seasonal care that gardens require. The dust continued to swirl in the beam of Sarah's flashlight as she reached for another folder, understanding now that she was exploring not just the city's archive of mysteries, but its collection of evidence that love could persist in the physical world, that care and dedication could continue to manifest even after the people who embodied them were no longer present to provide direct guidance. These deepest files contained stories that challenged conventional understanding of how the world worked, cases that had been investigated with professional thoroughness, yet had never yielded explanations that satisfied the rational mind. The officers who had documented these mysteries had served as witnesses to phenomena that suggested the boundary between the living and the dead was more permeable than most people wanted to believe, that love and responsibility could somehow continue to operate even when the people who had embodied them had passed beyond the reach of ordinary communication. The archive stretched endlessly into the darkness, containing thousands more folders filled with stories of anonymous assistance and unexplained kindness, cases that represented the city's collection of evidence that the world contained more mystery and meaning then could be captured by conventional categories of explanation. Each folder was a testament to the possibility that communities could be held together by forces that operated beyond the reach of law and regulation, that people could be connected by bonds of care and responsibility that transcended the limitations of individual lifetimes. Sarah understood now that she had discovered something precious, a repository of proof that love was more powerful than death, that kindness could operate according to its own mysterious logic, and that communities could be sustained by acts of anonymous generosity that revealed the hidden depths of human goodness. The fluorescent lights hummed their steady lullaby above the endless rows of filing cabinets, and Sarah reached for another folder, ready to discover whatever story of inexplicable kindness waited to be remembered in the accumulated dust and silence of the city's deepest archives. Asterisk Detective Sarah Chen had begun to venture beyond the basement archive, drawn by references in the older files to locations throughout the city where mysterious events had occurred. The reports spoke of courtrooms where cases had been heard long, after normal hours, of holding cells that had provided comfort to people who had never been arrested, of municipal buildings that had offered sanctuary to those who needed it most during the darkest hours of night. The old courthouse on Main Street rose 6 stories above the surrounding buildings, its limestone facade weathered by decades of rain and snow, but still imposing in the way that buildings from the 1920s had been designed to inspire respect for the law and the institutions that administered it. Sarah had obtained permission to explore the building during her off-duty hours, officially as part of a historical preservation survey, but really as a continuation of her journey through the city's accumulated mysteries. The main entrance hall stretched upward through all 6 floors, surrounded by balconies and staircases that created a sense of vertical grandeur that few modern buildings attempted to achieve. During the day, the space filled with the sounds of footsteps and conversations, the rustle of papers, and the distant hum of ventilation systems. But at night, when the last clerk had locked the doors and set the security system, the courthouse settled into a different kind of existence, one that seemed to operate according to older rules and forgotten purposes. Sarah's footsteps echoed against the marble floors as she climbed the central staircase to the 3rd floor, where the main courtrooms had been located since the building opened in 1923. The brass fixtures that had once held gas flames had been converted to electricity sometime in the 1940s, but they retained their original elegant proportions, casting pools of warm light that seemed somehow warmer and more welcoming than the fluorescent fixtures that had been added to supplement them. In later decades, Courtroom 3A had been the site of several incidents documented in the archive, cases where people had reported receiving legal assistance during nighttime hours when the building was supposedly empty and secure. The reports described a woman who appeared to be an elderly attorney, someone who possessed comprehensive knowledge of legal procedures and remarkable skill in helping people understand their rights and options during legal crises that had left them feeling confused and overwhelmed. The courtroom itself was a study in formal dignity, with oak paneling that rose 20 feet to meet a coffered ceiling decorated with the seals of the city, county, and state. The judge's bench dominated the front of the room, raised on a platform that emphasized the authority and gravitas of the judicial process. The witness stand sat to one side, positioned so that anyone giving testimony would face both the judge and the jury box, which could seat 12 citizens called to serve their community by determining questions of fact and law. Sarah sat in the gallery in one of the wooden pews that had been designed to accommodate families and observers during trials and hearings. The wood was worn smooth by decades of use, polished by the nervous hands of people waiting to learn their fate or the fate of someone they cared about. The room held a quality of attentive silence, as if it were accustomed to listening carefully to testimony and weighing the significance of every word spoken within its walls. Case number 197408-2156, had documented the experience of Mr. Robert Martinez, who had called police to report that he had received legal consultation in this courtroom during the early morning hours of a Sunday, when no court sessions were scheduled and the building was officially closed. Mr. Martinez had been facing eviction from his apartment, had been served with legal papers that he could not understand, and had been unable to afford an attorney to help him navigate the complex procedures that would determine whether he could keep his home. Officer Linda Thompson had interviewed Mr. Martinez, who described arriving at the courthouse in desperation, hoping to find someone who could explain the legal documents that threatened to destroy his stable housing situation. He had somehow gained access to the building, had found his way to courtroom 3A, and had encountered an elderly woman who was reviewing legal files by the light of the judge's reading lamp. The woman had introduced herself simply as someone who understood landlord-tenant law, had spent several hours explaining Mr. Martinez's rights and options, and had helped him prepare the documents he needed to respond properly to the eviction proceedings. She had shown him how to research similar cases, had explained the legal precedents that might support his position, and had given him the confidence he needed to represent himself effectively in court. Officer Thompson had attempted to identify the mysterious legal advisor, had checked with the courthouse security staff and the local bar association, had interviewed attorneys who might have been working in the building during unusual hours. But the investigation revealed no explanation for how Mr. Martinez had gained access to the locked courthouse, or who had provided him with the legal assistance that had ultimately enabled him to keep his apartment. Mr. Martinez told Officer Thompson that the elderly attorney had seemed to possess unlimited knowledge of housing law and remarkable patience in explaining complex legal concepts to someone who had no formal legal education. She had never asked for payment or recognition for her services, had simply provided the help he needed, and had encouraged him to use the knowledge she had shared to help other people facing similar challenges. The legal consultation had lasted until dawn, when the mysterious attorney had gathered her files and disappeared as quietly as she had appeared, leaving Mr. Martinez with detailed notes and a clear understanding of how to proceed with his case. He had successfully defended against the eviction, had used the legal strategies she had taught him to negotiate a fair resolution with his landlord, and had remained in his apartment for many years afterward. Sarah imagined the elderly attorney working in the empty courtroom through the night, surrounded by law books and case files, patiently explaining legal procedures to someone who desperately needed to understand them. Perhaps she was a retired attorney who missed the satisfaction of helping people navigate the legal system, who had found a way to continue providing the service that had given meaning to her professional life even after her official career had ended. The mysterious legal assistance represented more than just pro bono work. It represented a commitment to the principle that access to justice should not depend on the ability to pay for professional representation. The elderly attorney had ensured that Mr. Martinez received the legal help he needed to protect his rights, demonstrating that the law could serve as a tool for justice rather than just an instrument of institutional power. As Sarah continued her exploration of the courthouse, she began to understand that the building itself seemed to retain some memory of its original purpose, some commitment to serving justice that operated beyond normal business hours and official procedures. The empty courtrooms and chambers appeared to offer sanctuary to people who needed legal assistance but could not obtain it through conventional channels, as if the building remembered its duty to serve all citizens regardless of their circumstances. Courtroom 2B had been the site of another documented incident, case number 1976-31089, involving Mrs. Dorothy Chun, who had received family mediation services during nighttime hours when no official mediation programs were available. Mrs. Chun had been struggling with a custody dispute following her divorce, had been unable to afford professional mediation services, and had been facing the possibility of losing regular contact with her children because of communication breakdowns with her former husband. Officer Daniel Kim had interviewed Mrs. Chun, who described arriving at the courthouse late one evening in a state of emotional crisis, hoping to find some guidance about how to resolve the custody issues that were tearing her family apart. She had somehow gained access to courtroom 2B, where she had encountered a middle-aged woman who appeared to be a family counselor or mediator with extensive experience in helping divorced parents develop cooperative relationships. The mediator had spent the entire night working with Mrs. Chun, helping her understand her former husband's concerns and perspectives, teaching her communication techniques that could reduce conflict and increase cooperation, and helping her develop a parenting plan that would serve the best interests of their children while respecting both parents' rights and responsibilities. Officer Kim had attempted to identify the mysterious mediator, had checked with family court services and private mediation organizations, had interviewed professionals who might have been working in the courthouse during unusual hours. But the investigation revealed no official explanation for the mediation services that Mrs. Chun had received or the method by which she had gained access to the locked courtroom. The mediation session had concluded with Mrs. Chun feeling more confident about her ability to communicate effectively with her former husband and more optimistic about their ability to co-parent their children successfully despite their divorce. The mysterious mediator had provided her with written materials about child development and cooperative parenting, had given her specific scripts for difficult conversations, and had helped her understand that divorce did not have to mean the end of effective family relationships. Mrs. Chun had used the mediation techniques she had learned to improve her communication with her former husband, had successfully negotiated a custody arrangement that worked for everyone involved, and had maintained a positive co-parenting relationship for many years afterward. Officer Kim's follow-up reports noted that the entire family had benefited from the mediation services that Mrs. Chun had somehow received during that mysterious night in the empty courthouse. Sarah found herself thinking about the mediator who had dedicated her night to helping a struggling parent learn to communicate more effectively with her former spouse, who had understood that family conflicts could be resolved through patient guidance and skilled intervention, even when professional services were not officially available. Perhaps she was someone who had worked in family court for many years, who had seen too many families destroyed by poor communication and adversarial legal processes, who had found a way to continue helping families heal even after her official career had ended. The mysterious family mediation represented more than just counseling services. It represented a commitment to the principle that families deserve support during difficult transitions, that children's welfare should take priority over parental conflicts, that healing and reconciliation were possible even in the aftermath of divorce and separation. As Sarah moved through the courthouse's corridors, she began to appreciate the building's architecture not just as a backdrop for legal proceedings, but as a physical manifestation of ideals about justice and community service. The high ceilings and formal decorations were designed to inspire respect for the law, but they also created spaces that seemed to hold and amplify human voices, ensuring that testimony and arguments could be heard clearly by everyone present. The basement levels of the courthouse contained the holding cells that had been used to detain people awaiting trial or sentencing, spaces that had been designed with security in mind, but that had somehow acquired a reputation for providing comfort and support to people during their darkest hours. Case number 1978-11-1734 documented the experience of Mr. James Peterson, who had been arrested for public intoxication and had spent a night in custody that had somehow transformed his understanding of his own situation and possibilities. Officer Michael Santos had interviewed Mr. Peterson, who described being placed in a holding cell that somehow felt more like a counseling office than a detention facility. Despite being alone in the cell, he had felt as though someone was listening to him with genuine compassion and understanding, had felt encouraged to examine his relationship with alcohol and to consider what changes he might make to improve his life circumstances. Mr. Peterson told Officer Santos that he had experienced what felt like a conversation with someone who possessed extensive knowledge of addiction and recovery. Someone who had helped him understand that his drinking was a symptom of deeper problems that could be addressed through appropriate treatment and support services. The mysterious counselor had seemed to know about his family history, his work situation, and the emotional issues that had led him to use alcohol as a way of coping with stress and disappointment. Overnight stay in the holding cell had concluded with Mr. Peterson feeling more hopeful about his future than he had felt in years, more aware of his own strengths and potential, and more committed to seeking the help he needed to address his drinking problem. He had been released the following morning, with a clear plan for pursuing treatment and a sense that someone cared about whether he succeeded in changing his life. Officer Santos had attempted to identify the source of the counseling that Mr. Peterson claimed to have received during his night in custody, had checked with jail personnel and social services staff who might have been working in the building during overnight hours. But the investigation revealed no official explanation for the therapeutic intervention that had apparently occurred in the holding cell. Mr. Peterson had followed through on the treatment plan he had developed during his mysterious night in custody, had successfully completed an alcohol rehabilitation program, and had maintained his sobriety for many years afterward. Officer Santos's follow-up reports noted that Mr. Peterson had become an advocate for other people struggling with addiction, using the insights he had gained during his night in the courthouse holding cell to help others understand that recovery was possible with appropriate support and commitment. Sarah imagined the holding cell transformed into a space of healing and hope, where someone facing the consequences of their actions could receive the guidance and encouragement they needed to make positive changes in their lives. Perhaps the building itself remembered its original purpose of serving justice, which included not just punishment, but rehabilitation and the restoration of people to productive roles in their communities. The mysterious counseling services represented more than just informal therapy. They represented a commitment to the principle that every person had the potential for positive change, that addiction and other destructive behaviors could be addressed through compassionate intervention, that the criminal justice system could serve as a gateway to healing rather than just a mechanism for punishment. As Sarah continued her exploration of the courthouse, she began to understand that the building seemed to operate according to a higher understanding of justice, one that included not just legal procedures, but human compassion, not just punishment, but healing, not just the enforcement of law, but the restoration of community relationships. The empty corridors and chambers appeared to offer sanctuary to people who needed legal assistance, family guidance, or personal counseling but could not obtain such services through conventional channels. The third floor of the courthouse contained the law library, a high-ceilinged room lined with volumes that documented centuries of legal precedent and scholarly commentary. During regular hours, the library served attorneys and judges who needed to research points of law and legal procedure. But according to several files in the archive, the library had also provided research assistance to ordinary citizens during nighttime hours when professional legal help was not available through normal channels. Case number 19800500923 documented the experience of Mrs. Helen Foster, who had received comprehensive legal research assistance in the courthouse library during the early morning hours of a weekday, when the building was officially closed and no library staff were scheduled to be present. Mrs. Foster had been facing a complex legal issue involving her late husband's estate, had been unable to afford professional legal representation, and had been struggling to understand the probate procedures that would determine how his property would be distributed. Officer Carol Thompson had interviewed Mrs. Foster, who described gaining access to the courthouse library and finding extensive research materials that had been compiled specifically to address her legal questions. The materials included relevant statutes, case law precedents, and step-by-step guides for navigating the probate process without professional assistance. Mrs. Foster told Officer Thompson that the research materials had been organized with remarkable precision and attention to her specific circumstances, as if someone with extensive legal knowledge had anticipated exactly what information she would need and had prepared comprehensive resources to guide her through each step of the legal process. The materials included not just legal citations, but practical advice about filling out forms, meeting deadlines, and presenting her case effectively to the probate court. Officer Thompson had attempted to identify the source of the legal research assistance that Mrs. Foster had received, had interviewed law librarians and courthouse staff who might have been working during unusual hours. But the investigation revealed no official explanation for how the research materials had been compiled and organized. No record of anyone having access to the library during the hours when Mrs. Foster claimed to have received assistance. The legal research had enabled Mrs. Foster to successfully navigate the probate process on her own, to protect her interests and those of her late husband's other beneficiaries, and to complete the estate settlement without the expense of professional legal representation. Officer Thompson's follow-up reports noted that Mrs. Foster had used the knowledge she had gained to help other widows facing similar challenges, sharing the research techniques and legal insights that had been provided to her during her mysterious night in the courthouse. Library. Sarah imagined someone working through the night to compile legal research that would help an ordinary citizen understand complex procedures and protect her legal rights. Someone who possessed both extensive legal knowledge and genuine compassion for people struggling to navigate an intimidating system without professional assistance. Perhaps it was a retired law librarian who missed the satisfaction of helping people find the information they needed to solve their legal problems, who had found a way to continue providing research assistance even after official library hours had ended. The mysterious legal research represented more than just information services. It represented a commitment to the principle that access to legal knowledge should not depend on the ability to pay for professional research assistance, that ordinary citizens should be able to understand and protect their legal rights even when they could not afford to hire attorneys to represent them. As Sarah walked through the courthouse's marble corridors, she began to appreciate the building as more than just a place where legal proceedings occurred. It seemed to be a living embodiment of ideals about justice and community service that operated beyond the constraints of normal business hours and official procedures. The empty courtrooms and chambers appeared to retain some memory of their original purpose, some commitment to serving all citizens regardless of their ability to pay for professional services. The courthouse's basement levels contained not just holding cells but also record storage areas where decades of legal documents were preserved in climate-controlled environment that protected them from deterioration and loss. According to several files in the archive, these storage areas had somehow provided people with access to historical legal documents that helped them understand their rights and resolve contemporary legal issues. Case number 1982091456 documented the experience of Mr. Thomas Anderson, who had gained access to property records that helped him resolve a boundary dispute with his neighbor. Records that had been stored in the courthouse basement, but were not normally accessible to the general public during regular business hours. Officer Lisa Martinez had interviewed Mr. Anderson, who described receiving assistance from someone who appeared to be a records clerk with comprehensive knowledge of the courthouse's historical document collection. The mysterious clerk had helped him locate property deeds and survey records that documented the original boundaries of his property, information that had been crucial for resolving the dispute without expensive litigation. Mr. Anderson told Officer Martinez that the records clerk had possessed remarkable knowledge of the courthouse's filing systems and had been able to locate documents that dated back to the original land grants from the early 1800s. The clerk had explained how to interpret the old survey descriptions, had helped him understand the legal significance of various boundary markers, and had provided him with certified copies of the documents he needed to support his position in the boundary dispute. Officer Martinez had attempted to identify the mysterious records clerk, had interviewed courthouse personnel who might have been working during unusual hours, had checked the building's security records for evidence of after-hours access to the basement storage areas. But the investigation revealed no official explanation for the assistance that Mr. Anderson had received, or the method by which he had gained access to restricted record storage areas. The historical property research had enabled Mr. Anderson to resolve his boundary dispute amicably with his neighbor, to establish clear property lines that both parties could accept, and to avoid the expense and stress of litigation over what had initially seemed like an irreconcilable disagreement. Officer Martinez's follow-up reports noted that both neighbors had been satisfied with the resolution and had maintained friendly relationships. Afterward, Sarah found herself thinking about the records clerk who had dedicated time to helping an ordinary citizen understand his property rights and locate the historical documents needed to resolve a boundary dispute. Someone who had possessed both extensive knowledge of the courthouse's records and genuine concern for helping people solve their legal problems without expensive litigation. Perhaps it was someone who had worked in courthouse records for many years, who understood the value of historical documents and had found a way to make them accessible to people who needed them. The mysterious records assistance represented more than just clerical services. It represented a commitment to the principle that historical documents should serve the public good, that property rights should be based on accurate information rather than incomplete records, that neighbors should be able to resolve disputes through research and discussion rather than adversarial legal proceedings. As Sarah continued her exploration of the courthouse, she began to understand that every level of the building seemed to operate according to the same principles of service and accessibility that characterized the mysterious assistance documented throughout the archive. From the courtrooms where people received legal consultation to the library, where they found research materials, to the basement where they accessed historical records, the courthouse appeared to function as a comprehensive resource for anyone who needed help understanding or protecting their legal rights. The building's architecture supported this understanding of justice as something that should be accessible to all citizens rather than just those who could afford professional representation. The high ceilings and formal decorations created an atmosphere of dignity and respect that reminded everyone who entered that legal proceedings were serious matters that deserved careful attention and thoughtful consideration. The courthouse's role in the community extended beyond its official functions to include serving as a sanctuary for people who needed legal assistance but could not obtain it through conventional channels. The empty corridors and chambers seemed to retain some memory of their original purpose, some commitment to ensuring that justice was available to all citizens, regardless of their economic circumstances or social position. Sarah understood now that the courthouse represented something precious, a physical manifestation of ideals about justice and community, service that operated according to principles higher than law and regulation, that created space for human compassion and practical assistance to flourish, even when formal institutions could not provide adequate support. The building seemed to remember its duty to serve all citizens, to provide sanctuary for those who needed help, and to ensure that access to justice did not depend on the ability to pay for professional services. The fluorescent lights hummed softly in the empty corridors, and Sarah made her way back toward the main entrance, understanding that she had experienced something remarkable, a building that had somehow retained its soul, that continued to serve its original purpose even when no official staff were present to provide assistance. The courthouse stood as evidence that ideals about justice and community service could become embedded in physical spaces, creating environments that offered help and guidance to anyone who needed them, regardless of the hour or the circumstances that brought them there. Detective Sarah Chun had begun to understand that the mysteries documented in the archive were not isolated incidents but part of a larger pattern of care that wove through the neighborhoods of the city like an invisible network of mutual support. The cases she had studied revealed communities where people looked after each other in ways that transcended formal institutions and official programs, where families and neighbors created safety nets that caught people when they fell and lifted them back to their feet with quiet dignity. The residential areas of the city held their own secrets, their own stories of anonymous assistance and unexplained kindness that had been documented by police officers who understood that their role extended beyond law enforcement to include witnessing the full spectrum of human behavior. These neighborhood cases revealed how communities functioned when they operated according to principles of mutual care, when people took responsibility for each other's welfare without expecting recognition or reward. Maple Street had been the site of several documented incidents, cases that revealed how a single block could function as an extended family where everyone's needs were known and quietly addressed by neighbors who understood that individual welfare was inseparable from community health. The tree-lined street stretched for 6 blocks through a residential area that had been developed in the 1940s for working-class families. Modest houses with small front yards and larger backyards where children could play safely while their parents worked to build better lives. Case number 1983101-245 had documented the experience of the Morrison family, who had discovered that someone was providing childcare for their 3 young children during family emergencies without any advance arrangement or request for such services. Mrs. Patricia Morrison had called police to report that a woman appeared at their house whenever the family faced a crisis, provided competent and caring supervision for the children, and disappeared as quietly as she had arrived once the emergency had been resolved. Officer Janet Wilson had interviewed Mrs. Morrison, who described several instances when the mysterious caregiver had appeared just when her family needed help most. When Mr. Morrison had been hospitalized following a heart attack, the caregiver had arrived within hours to ensure that the children were fed, bathed, and comforted while Mrs. Morrison spent time at the hospital managing medical decisions and insurance paperwork that required her full attention. The caregiver seemed to possess detailed knowledge of each child's individual needs and preferences, knew their bedtime routines and favorite foods, understood their fears and the specific kinds of reassurance they needed during stressful situations when their normal family routines had been disrupted. She never asked for payment or recognition for her services, simply provided the help that was needed and encouraged the children to be patient and supportive while their parents dealt with whatever crisis had temporarily changed their families. Circumstances. Mrs. Morrison told Officer Wilson that the mysterious caregiver had the remarkable ability to keep the children calm and secure during situations that could have been traumatic for young people who didn't fully understand why their normal routines had suddenly changed. The caregiver explained things in age-appropriate ways, helped the children feel useful by giving them small tasks to help their family, and maintained a sense of stability and safety that children need even when adult situations are uncertain and stressful. Wilson had attempted to identify the anonymous caregiver, had interviewed neighbors who might have seen her arriving or leaving the Morrison house, had checked with local child care services and church organizations that might have provided emergency assistance, but the investigation revealed no official explanation for the child care services that the Morrison family had received. No record of any formal program that provided such assistance, and no neighbors who admitted to being aware of the family's emergency situations. The mysterious childcare had continued for approximately 2 years, providing assistance during various family crises, including illnesses, job losses, and other unexpected situations that required parents to focus their attention on adult responsibilities while ensuring that their children continued to receive appropriate care and supervision. The service had ended gradually as the Morrison children grew older and more capable of understanding and coping with temporary disruptions to their normal routines. Mrs. Morrison's follow-up interviews noted that the anonymous caregiver had provided more than just supervision. She had given the entire family the gift of knowing that their children would be safe and well cared for during emergencies, allowing parents to handle crises without the additional stress of worrying about childcare arrangements. The mysterious caregiver had demonstrated that communities could provide essential services through informal networks of care that operated more effectively than many official programs. Sarah imagined the caregiver who had dedicated herself to ensuring that children in the neighborhood never had to face family emergencies without appropriate adult supervision and support. Someone who had somehow developed the ability to sense when families were in crisis and to respond immediately with exactly the kind of help that was needed most. Perhaps she was someone who had raised her own children and grandchildren, who understood that the most important thing during any family crisis was maintaining the children's sense of security and stability. The anonymous childcare represented more than just babysitting services. It represented a commitment to the principle that children's welfare should never depend on their family's ability to arrange formal childcare during emergencies. That communities had a responsibility to ensure that young people were protected and cared for even when their parents were dealing with situations that demanded their full attention. As Sarah continued through the neighborhood files, she began to understand that Maple Street functioned as a kind of extended family where everyone's welfare was quietly monitored and supported by neighbors who understood that individual problems could become community problems if they were not addressed promptly and effectively. The cases revealed a network of mutual care that operated according to unwritten rules of reciprocity and shared responsibility. Case number 1984-71789 documented the experience of elderly residents throughout the neighborhood who had discovered that someone was providing grocery shopping and meal delivery services during periods when they were unable to leave their homes due to illness, injury, or severe weather conditions. The services were provided without any formal arrangement or payment, appearing whenever residents needed assistance with basic necessities that they could not obtain independently. Officer Michael Santos had interviewed several elderly residents who described receiving grocery deliveries that included exactly the items they needed, prepared meals that matched their dietary requirements and personal preferences, and other forms of assistance that enabled them to maintain their independence while ensuring that they received proper nutrition and care during temporary periods of reduced mobility. Mrs. Helen Chun, age 84, told Officer Santos that the mysterious grocery service had appeared during a 2-week period when she was recovering from hip surgery and could not drive to the supermarket or carry heavy bags of groceries. The delivery person seemed to know exactly what items she normally purchased, understood her dietary restrictions and medication requirements, and provided high-quality groceries that were carefully selected and reasonably priced. The grocery deliveries were always accompanied by prepared meals that were nutritious, delicious, and appropriate for Mrs. Chun's reduced appetite during her recovery period. The meals were packaged in containers that she could easily heat and serve, with clear instructions for preparation and suggestions for side dishes that would provide balanced nutrition while remaining appealing to someone whose illness had temporarily reduced her interest in food. Officer Santos had attempted to identify the source of the grocery delivery service, had checked with local supermarkets and delivery companies that might have been providing such assistance, had interviewed neighbors who might have been coordinating informal support for elderly residents. But the investigation revealed no official explanation for the services that elderly residents had received. No record of any formal program that provided grocery delivery and meal preparation, and no neighbors who admitted to organizing or participating in such assistance. Mr. Robert Foster, age 79, described a similar experience during a period when severe winter weather had made it dangerous for him to leave his house for several weeks. The mysterious delivery service had provided not just groceries and prepared meals, but also essential medications, heating fuel, and other necessities that had enabled him to remain safely in his own home during conditions that might otherwise have required him to seek temporary housing elsewhere. Delivery person had demonstrated remarkable knowledge of what each elderly resident needed to maintain their health and independence, understanding not just their immediate material needs but also their emotional requirements for maintaining dignity and autonomy during periods of vulnerability. The services were provided in ways that preserved recipients' privacy and self-respect, making it clear that the assistance was a temporary response to specific circumstances rather than an indication that the recipients were no longer capable of caring for themselves. Officer Santos's follow-up reports noted that the mysterious grocery and meal delivery service had enabled several elderly residents to recover from illnesses and injuries in their own homes rather than in institutional settings, had prevented hospitalizations that might have resulted from inadequate nutrition during recovery periods, and had demonstrated that communities could provide essential support services through informal networks that operated more efficiently and compassionately than many official programs. Sarah found herself thinking about the person or people who had taken responsibility for ensuring that elderly neighbors never had to choose between their safety and their independence, who had somehow developed systems for monitoring the welfare of vulnerable residents and responding immediately when assistance was needed. Perhaps it was a network of adult children who had aging parents in the neighborhood, people who understood the challenges of maintaining independence while dealing with health issues and mobility limitations. The mysterious grocery delivery service represented more than just convenience shopping. It represented a commitment to the principle that aging should not mean losing the ability to remain in familiar surroundings, that temporary health problems should not force people to give up their independence, that communities had a responsibility to provide practical support that enabled residents to maintain their dignity while receiving the assistance they needed. The neighborhood cases continued to reveal the same patterns of mutual care and shared responsibility, each incident adding another layer to Sarah's understanding of how communities could function when they operated according to principles of collective welfare rather than individual competition. Case number 198503216-7 documented a system of transportation services that had somehow emerged to help residents who could no longer drive safely but still needed access to medical appointments, grocery shopping, and other essential activities. Officer Patricia Kim had investigated reports from multiple residents who described receiving transportation assistance from someone who seemed to know exactly when they needed rides and where they needed to go, despite never having requested such services or provided information about their schedules and appointments. The transportation was provided in a clean, comfortable vehicle by a driver who was always punctual, courteous, and knowledgeable about the locations of medical facilities, shopping centers, and other destinations throughout the city. Mrs. Dorothy Martinez, age 73, told Officer Kim that the mysterious transportation service had begun appearing shortly after she had reluctantly given up driving following a series of minor accidents that had convinced her that her vision and reflexes were no longer adequate for safe operation of a motor vehicle. The driver had somehow learned about her medical appointment schedule, had appeared at her house at appropriate times, and had provided door-to-door service that enabled her to maintain her independence, while ensuring that she could access necessary health care and other services. That the driver demonstrated remarkable knowledge of each passenger's individual needs and limitations, understanding which passengers required assistance walking from the vehicle to their destinations, which ones needed extra time to manage mobility equipment, and which ones appreciated conversation during the ride, while others preferred to travel in comfortable silence. The service was provided without charge and without any apparent expectation of payment or recognition. Mr. James Townsend, age 68, described receiving transportation assistance during a period when his wife was hospitalized and he needed to make daily visits while also managing household responsibilities that required trips to the pharmacy, grocery store, and bank. The mysterious driver had somehow coordinated multiple stops into efficient routes that enabled him to accomplish everything he needed to do while spending maximum time with his wife. During her recovery period, Officer Kim had attempted to identify the source of the transportation service, had checked with local transit agencies and private transportation companies that might have been providing such assistance, had interviewed residents who might have been coordinating informal ride-sharing arrangements. But the investigation revealed no official explanation for the transportation services that residents had received, no record of any formal program that provided door-to-door service for elderly and disabled residents, and no neighbors who admitted to organizing or participating in such assistance. The mysterious transportation service had operated for approximately 3 years, providing rides for dozens of residents who had lost the ability to drive safely but still needed access to medical care, shopping, and other essential activities. The service had enabled people to maintain their independence and remain in their own homes rather than moving to assisted living facilities where transportation would have been provided as part of more comprehensive care packages. Officer Kim's follow-up reports noted that the transportation service had prevented social isolation that often occurred when people could no longer drive, had ensured that residents received necessary medical care and maintained connections with friends and family members, and had demonstrated that communities could provide essential mobility services through informal networks that operated more flexibly and compassionately than many official transportation programs. Sarah imagined the driver, who had dedicated so much time to ensuring that neighbors could access the services and social connections they needed to maintain their quality of life. Someone who had understood that transportation was often the key factor that determined whether people could continue living independently or would be forced to give up their homes and move to institutional settings. Perhaps it was someone who had watched their own parents struggle with mobility limitations, who had learned firsthand how transportation barriers could quickly lead to social isolation and declining health. The mysterious transportation service represented more than just free rides. It represented a commitment to the principle that mobility should not depend on individual car ownership, that aging and disability should not mean losing access to essential services and social connections, that communities had a responsibility to ensure that all residents could participate fully in community life, regardless of their transportation limitations. As Sarah continued through the neighborhood files, she began to see how these various forms of assistance worked together to create a comprehensive support system that operated without formal organization or official recognition. The child care services, grocery delivery, meal preparation, and transportation assistance all served to strengthen the community's ability to care for its most vulnerable members while preserving everyone's dignity and independence. Case number 1986-110834 documented a home maintenance and repair service that had somehow emerged to help residents who could no longer perform the physical work required to keep their properties safe and attractive, but who could not afford to hire professional contractors to perform necessary maintenance tasks. Officer Daniel Rodriguez had investigated reports from homeowners throughout the neighborhood who described discovering that maintenance work had been completed on their properties during nighttime hours when no one was present to supervise or authorize such work. The work included painting, roof repairs, plumbing fixes, electrical upgrades, and landscaping projects that improved both the safety and appearance of affected properties. Mrs. Agnes Kowalski, age 76, told Officer Rodriguez that someone had repaired the front steps of her house, which had become dangerously loose and unstable, but which she could not afford to have fixed professionally. The repairs had been completed with high-quality materials and professional skill, improving not just the safety of the steps, but their appearance and durability. The work had been done without disturbing her sleep or daily routines, completed sometime during the night hours when she was inside and unaware of the activity. The anonymous maintenance workers demonstrated comprehensive knowledge of building codes and safety requirements, understanding which repairs were most urgent for protecting residents' health and safety, which improvements would have the greatest impact on property values and neighborhood appearance, and which materials and techniques would provide the most durable and cost-effective solutions. Mr. Carl Peterson, age 62, described discovering that someone had repaired the roof of his house following a severe storm that had damaged several shingles and created the potential for water damage. The repairs had been completed with materials that matched the existing roof perfectly, using techniques that would provide long-term protection against weather damage while maintaining the house's architectural integrity. Officer Rodriguez had attempted to identify the source of the mysterious home maintenance service, had checked with local contractors and building supply companies that might have been providing such assistance, had interviewed residents who might have been coordinating informal work crews to help neighbors with property maintenance needs. But the investigation revealed no official explanation for the maintenance work that homeowners had received, no record of any formal program that provided free home repairs, and no neighbors who admitted to organizing or participating in such assistance. The mysterious home maintenance had continued for approximately 4 years, completing hundreds of repair and improvement projects throughout the neighborhood, while helping to maintain property values and community appearance. The work had enabled elderly and disabled residents to remain safely in their homes, rather than moving to housing where maintenance would have been provided as part of rental agreements or assisted living services. Officer Rodriguez's follow-up reports noted that the anonymous maintenance service had prevented accidents and injuries that could have resulted from deferred maintenance, had preserved the neighborhood's attractive appearance and stable property values, and had demonstrated that communities could provide essential services through informal networks that operated more efficiently and compassionately than many official programs. Sarah found herself thinking about the maintenance workers who had dedicated their skills and time to ensuring that neighbors could maintain safe and attractive homes even when they could no longer perform physical work or afford professional services. Perhaps it was a group of skilled tradespeople who had grown up in the neighborhood, who understood that property maintenance was essential for both individual safety and community welfare, who had found ways to use their professional skills to serve their neighbors without expecting monetary compensation. The mysterious home maintenance service represented more than just free repairs. It represented a commitment to the principle that housing quality should not depend solely on individual financial resources, That aging and disability should not mean having to live in unsafe or deteriorating conditions. That communities had a responsibility to ensure that all residents could maintain their homes to standards that protected both individual welfare and collective property values. The neighborhood files continued to reveal the same themes of mutual care and shared responsibility, each case adding another dimension to Sarah's understanding of how communities could function when they operated according to principles of collective welfare. Case number 19870511623 documented an educational support system that had emerged to help families whose children were struggling academically but who could not afford professional tutoring or educational assistance. Officer Sharon Wilson had investigated reports from parents throughout the neighborhood who described discovering that their children were receiving tutoring and educational support from someone who seemed to know exactly what academic help each student needed and how to provide instruction in ways that matched individual learning styles and interests. Mrs. Linda Foster told Officer Wilson that her 10-year-old son had been struggling with reading comprehension and mathematics, falling behind his classmates despite her attempts to help him with homework and study skills. The mysterious tutor had somehow learned about her son's academic difficulties and had begun providing personalized instruction that helped him understand concepts that had previously been confusing and frustrating. The tutoring sessions apparently took place during after-school hours when Mrs. Foster was at work and could not supervise her son's activities. Yet her son consistently returned home with completed homework, improved understanding of difficult concepts, and increased confidence in his academic abilities. The tutor never asked for payment or recognition, simply provided the educational support that helped students succeed in school while building their self-esteem and motivation to continue learning. Mr. Robert Chun described a similar experience with his teenage daughter, who had been having difficulty with chemistry and algebra courses that were required for her college preparatory program. The mysterious tutor had provided advanced instruction that helped his daughter not only pass her required courses, but develop genuine interest in scientific and mathematical subjects that had previously seemed impossibly difficult. Officer Wilson had attempted to identify the source of the educational support services, had checked with local schools and tutoring companies that might have been providing such assistance, had interviewed teachers who might have been offering informal after-school help to struggling students. But the investigation revealed no official explanation for the tutoring services that students had received. No record of any formal program that provided free educational assistance, and no neighbors who admitted to possessing the advanced knowledge and teaching skills that the tutoring clearly demonstrated. The mysterious educational support had continued for approximately 5 years, helping dozens of students improve their academic performance while developing better study skills and increased confidence in their learning abilities. The assistance had enabled students to qualify for advanced courses in college, preparatory programs that might otherwise have been beyond their reach, creating opportunities for educational achievement that had long-term impacts on their career, prospects, and life outcomes. Officer Wilson's follow-up reports noted that the anonymous tutoring service had prevented academic failures that could have led to students dropping out of school, had enabled students from working class families to compete successfully with peers who had access to expensive private tutoring, and had demonstrated that communities could provide essential educational services through informal networks that operated more flexibly and effectively than many official academic support programs. Sarah imagined the tutor, who had dedicated so much time to ensuring that neighborhood children received the educational support they needed to succeed academically. Someone who had understood that educational opportunity should not depend on family income, who had possessed both advanced knowledge and exceptional teaching skills that enabled students to overcome academic challenges and discover their own learning potential. The mysterious tutoring service represented more than just free academic help. It represented a commitment to the principle that educational success should be available to all students, regardless of their family's economic circumstances. That academic struggles should not determine children's future opportunities. That communities had a responsibility to ensure that young people received the educational support they needed to develop their full potential. As Sarah continued through the files, she began to understand that these neighborhood support systems had created something precious, communities where people could age with dignity, where children could grow up safely, where families could face crises without losing their stability, where everyone's welfare was quietly protected by neighbors who understood that individual and community well-being were inseparably connected. The cases revealed networks of care that had operated according to principles of mutual responsibility and shared commitment to collective welfare, creating safety nets that caught people when they fell and helped them regain their footing without shame or stigma. These communities had demonstrated that formal institutions and official programs were not always necessary for ensuring that people's needs were met, that informal networks of care could often provide more effective and compassionate assistance than bureaucratic systems designed to serve large populations. The fluorescent lights hummed softly above the filing cabinets, and Sarah reached for another folder, understanding that she was exploring more than just police reports. She was discovering evidence of how communities could function when they operated according to the highest human values, when people took responsibility for each other's welfare without expecting recognition or reward, when neighborhoods became extended families where everyone's needs were known and quietly addressed by people who understood that caring for others was simply part of being human. Archives stretched endlessly around her, containing thousands more stories of anonymous assistance and unexplained kindness, each one adding another thread to the tapestry of mutual care that had once woven through the neighborhoods of the city like an invisible network of love made manifest in countless acts of practical assistance and quiet generosity. Detective Sarah Chun had begun to spend entire nights at the 3rd Precinct, not just in the basement archive, but in the quiet spaces where the night shift worked through their careful routines of documentation and observation. She had come to understand that the building itself was part of the story she was trying to piece together, that the police officers who worked during the overnight hours were witnesses to a different version of the city than their daylight colleagues ever encountered. The night shift operated according to its own rhythms and protocols, moving through the dark hours with a deliberate pace that seemed designed more for contemplation than action. The officers who chose to work these hours were often people who found something peaceful in the solitude, who appreciated the way that late-night police work became less about responding to emergencies and more about bearing witness to the subtle mysteries that emerged when most of the city was asleep. Sergeant Maria Santos had been working the night shift for 15 years, had written thousands of reports during the quiet hours when the precinct felt more like a library than a law enforcement facility. She had agreed to let Sarah observe her work, to understand how the mysterious cases that filled the archive had been originally investigated and documented by officers who took pride in their careful attention to details that might seem insignificant to anyone who had not learned to appreciate the patterns that emerged from patient observation. The main desk in the precinct's front office was positioned so that whoever was working could see both the entrance and the hallway that led to the back offices where detectives and administrators worked during regular business hours. During the night shift, this area became the quiet center of operations, where reports were typed and filed, where phone calls were answered and logged, where the steady work of documentation continued even when nothing dramatic was happening elsewhere in the city. Sergeant Santos explained that night shift work was different from day shift policing, that the people who called for assistance during overnight hours were often dealing with problems that could not be easily categorized or quickly resolved. The darkness seemed to bring out both the best and worst in human nature, creating situations that required officers to serve not just as law enforcement officials, but as counselors, mediators, and witnesses to experiences that challenged conventional understanding of how communities function. Case number 1988-41567 had been documented by Officer Robert Chun during a night shift that had begun like any other, but had evolved into something that challenged his understanding of what police work could accomplish. The case involved Mrs. Eleanor Hoffman, who had called at 2:17 a.m. to report that someone was reading to her husband in the memory care facility where he lived. Despite visiting hours having ended at 8 p.m. and the building being secured for the night, Officer Chun had responded to the call, had met Mrs. Hoffman at the Sunset Manor facility, and had accompanied her to her husband's room, where they had indeed found an elderly woman reading aloud from a book that Mr. Hoffman had apparently been enjoying despite his advanced Alzheimer's disease. The mysterious reader had looked up calmly when they entered, had explained that Mr. Hoffman seemed to enjoy the stories from his youth, and had then gathered her things and left without providing any identification or explanation for how she had gained access to the secured facility. Mrs. Hoffman told Officer Chun that her husband had not responded to visitors or recognized family members for more than 6 months, but that he had seemed alert and engaged while listening to the mystery reader. She had been visiting him earlier that evening when staff members had announced the end of visiting hours, and she had reluctantly left him alone as she had every night for the past year, since his condition had deteriorated to the point where he no longer recognized her presence. Officer Chun had interviewed this facility's night staff, who confirmed that the building was properly secured and that they had no knowledge of any authorized visitor who might have been in Mr. Hoffman's room during the hours when Mrs. Hoffman claimed to have observed the reading session. The facility's security system showed no record of unauthorized entry, and the staff members who had been on duty could offer no explanation for how someone had gained access to the locked memory care unit. The report that Officer Chun had written described not just the factual details of his investigation, but his observations about the effect that the mysterious reading session seemed to have had on Mr. Hoffman, who appeared more peaceful and content than his wife had seen him in months. Officer Chun noted that whoever had been providing the reading service possessed obvious skill in working with people who had dementia, understanding how to select material that could engage someone whose cognitive abilities had been severely compromised. Mrs. Hoffman explained to Officer Chun that her husband had been a high school English teacher for 37 years, that he had loved literature and had spent countless hours reading to their children and grandchildren. The mysterious reader seemed to have somehow learned about his background and had selected books and stories that connected with memories that persisted even though his ability to recognize people and places had been lost to the progression of his disease. Officer Chun's investigation continued over several weeks, during which time he documented additional instances of the mysterious reading service appearing at the memory care facility. The reader seemed to possess uncanny knowledge of which residents might benefit from such attention, always selecting material that was appropriate for each person's cognitive level and personal history, while providing the kind of human connection that institutional care could rarely offer, even with the best intentions and adequate staffing. The reading sessions continued for approximately 3 months, during which time several residents showed improvements in their behavior and engagement that surprised both family members and facility staff. The mysterious reader provided not just entertainment, but a form of therapy that seemed to reach parts of their personalities that had been dormant since their conditions had begun to isolate them from meaningful human connection. Officer Shun's follow-up reports noted that the reading service had demonstrated the positive impact that individual attention could have on people whose cognitive disabilities made it difficult for them to benefit from conventional social activities and therapeutic programs. The mysterious reader had provided something precious, evidence that people with dementia retained the capacity for enjoyment and connection even when they could no longer communicate in conventional ways. Sarah found herself thinking about the reader who had dedicated her time to ensuring that people in memory care received the kind of individual attention that could reach across the barriers created by cognitive decline. Someone who had understood that literature and storytelling could provide comfort and stimulation even for people whose ability to process complex information had been severely compromised. The mysterious reading service represented more than just entertainment. It represented a commitment to the principle that people with dementia deserved to be treated as individuals with personal histories and preferences, that cognitive decline should not mean losing access to the cultural and intellectual experiences that had given meaning to their lives before. Their illnesses had changed their circumstances. As Sarah continued her observations of night shift operations, she began to understand that the officers who worked during these hours developed a different relationship with the community than their daylight counterparts, that the darkness created opportunities for kinds of assistance and intervention that were not possible during the busier hours when police work focused more on responding to immediate crises than on building long-term relationships with residents who needed ongoing support. Sergeant Santos explained that night shift officers often became familiar with people who were struggling with chronic problems that could not be solved through conventional law enforcement techniques, individuals whose needs required creative approaches and patient attention that were not always possible during the rapid response mode of day shift policing. Case number 198908223-4 had been documented by Officer Jennifer Martinez during a series of night shifts that had brought her into contact with Mr. James Peterson, an elderly man who had been calling police several times each week to report suspicious activities in his neighborhood that investigating officers could never verify or explain. Officer Martinez had initially approached Mr. Peterson's calls as potential signs of developing dementia or paranoid ideation, but her investigation had revealed that he was mentally sharp and observant, that his reports consistently described real phenomena that other people in the neighborhood had also noticed but had not thought to report to police. Mr. Peterson lived alone in a house where he had raised his family and had spent 43 years working as a machinist at the local factory before his retirement 8 years earlier. He kept careful notes about unusual activities in his neighborhood, had developed systems for monitoring patterns of behavior that seemed out of place, and had become an unofficial community watchman who noticed things that other residents missed because they were too busy with their own daily routines to pay attention to subtle changes in their environment. Officer Martinez had begun visiting Mr. Peterson regularly during her night shift patrols, not to investigate specific complaints, but to check on his welfare and to learn about the neighborhood dynamics that he observed from his front porch, where he spent most evenings reading and watching the activities on his street. These regular visits had revealed that Mr. Peterson possessed remarkable knowledge about his neighbors' routines and needs, that he had developed informal systems for monitoring the welfare of elderly residents and families with young children, and that he often served as an early warning system for problems that could be addressed more effectively if they were identified before they became serious enough to require emergency intervention. Officer Martinez's reports documented how Mr. Peterson's observations had helped identify several situations where elderly residents needed assistance, where families were facing crises that had not yet come to official attention, and where community problems were developing that could be addressed more effectively through early intervention than through reactive responses after they had already caused significant disruption. The collaboration between Officer Martinez and Mr. Peterson had created an informal partnership that enhanced the police department's ability to serve the neighborhood while providing Mr. Peterson with a sense of purpose and usefulness that had helped him adjust to the social isolation that often accompanied retirement from jobs that had provided daily contact with coworkers and community members. Officer Martinez's follow-up reports noted that Mr. Peterson's unofficial community monitoring had prevented several crimes, had identified families in need of assistance before their situations had become desperate, and had demonstrated that police effectiveness could be enhanced through partnerships with community members who possess detailed knowledge of local conditions and relationships. Sarah found herself thinking about Mr. Peterson and other residents like him, people who had chosen to serve their communities as unofficial guardians and observers, who had used their time and attention to create informal safety nets that caught problems before they became crises. Perhaps retirement from formal employment could become an opportunity for different kinds of community service, ways of contributing to collective welfare that utilize the knowledge and experience that older residents had accumulated over lifetimes of paying attention to how neighborhoods functioned. The informal community monitoring represented more than just vigilance. It represented a commitment to the principle that community safety was a shared responsibility that required the participation of residents who cared enough to pay attention to their neighbors' welfare and to communicate with police officers who understood the value of building relationships with people who possessed detailed knowledge of local conditions. The night shift officers that Sarah observed all seemed to understand that their role extended beyond law enforcement to include serving as connectors and coordinators, people who could help link community resources with individual needs, who could identify patterns and relationships that were not apparent to officials who only encountered neighborhoods during crisis situations. Officer Daniel Kim had been working night shifts for 12 years, had developed expertise in recognizing the signs of domestic violence, substance abuse, mental health crises, and other problems that often became more visible during overnight hours, when people's normal coping mechanisms were weakened by fatigue, isolation, and the psychological effects of darkness. Case number 19901-20945 had been documented by Officer Kim during a series of responses to domestic disturbance, calls that had initially seemed like routine interventions, but had evolved into something more complex and ultimately more successful than conventional police responses to family conflicts. The calls had come from neighbors of the Rodriguez family, who reported hearing arguments and possible physical violence from the apartment next door during late night and early morning hours when normal mediation resources were not available. Officer Kim had responded to several such calls, had found evidence of domestic conflict, but no immediate signs of physical violence, and had begun working with both Mr. and Mrs. Rodriguez to develop strategies for managing their disputes without escalating to violence. Officer Kim's approach had involved patient listening, practical problem solving, and connections to community resources that could address some of the underlying stresses that were contributing to the family's conflicts, rather than focusing solely on law enforcement responses to individual incidents. He had worked to understand the broader context that's creating conditions for repeated disputes. The Rodriguez family was dealing with unemployment, financial stress, childcare challenges, and extended family pressures that had created a situation where minor disagreements quickly escalated into major conflicts that disturbed their neighbors and created risks for their 3 young children. Officer Kim had helped them identify community resources for job training, financial counseling, childcare assistance, and family mediation that addressed root causes, rather than just symptoms of their difficulties. Officer Kim's reports documented how this comprehensive approach had gradually reduced the frequency and intensity of domestic disturbance calls from the Rodriguez household, had improved the family's stability and economic situation, and had demonstrated that police intervention could be most effective when it was combined with social services and community support rather than relying solely on law enforcement techniques. The success with the Rodriguez family had led Officer Kim to develop similar approaches with other families who were experiencing chronic conflicts that generated repeated calls for police assistance. His reports showed how night shift officers could serve as case managers and community liaisons, helping families access resources and develop skills that prevented problems from recurring. Officer Kim's follow-up reports noted that his comprehensive approach to domestic dispute resolution had prevented several situations from escalating to violence, had helped families develop better communication and problem-solving skills, and had demonstrated that police effectiveness could be enhanced when officers had time and authorization to address underlying causes rather than just responding to immediate symptoms. Sarah found herself thinking about Officer Kim and other night shift officers who had developed skills in crisis intervention and community development, who had learned to see police work as an opportunity to help people solve problems rather than just responding to emergencies after problems had already caused significant disruption. The comprehensive approach to domestic dispute resolution represented more than just effective policing. It represented a commitment to the principle that public safety was enhanced when families had access to the resources they needed to resolve conflicts constructively, that prevention was more effective than punishment, that police officers could serve as bridges between people in crisis and community resources that could help them build more stable and satisfying lives. As Sarah continued her observations of night shift operations, she began to understand that the officers who worked during these hours had developed a different philosophy of police work than their daylight colleagues, that the darkness and relative quiet created opportunities for more thoughtful and comprehensive approaches to community problems. The night shift officers she observed all seemed to share commitment to documentation that went beyond the minimum requirements for official reports, taking time to record details and observations that might seem insignificant to anyone who did not understand the long-term patterns they were trying to identify and address. Sergeant Santos explained that night shift work attracted officers who enjoyed the intellectual challenges of investigation and analysis, who found satisfaction in solving mysteries and building cases through patient attention to evidence that accumulated slowly over time. The darkness provided cover for activities that were not always visible during daylight hours, creating opportunities for officers to observe and document behaviors and relationships that revealed how communities actually functioned when they thought no one was watching. Case number 19910311788 had been documented during a series of night shift patrols that had brought Officer Patricia Wong into contact with a network of informal childcare and elder care services that operated throughout the residential neighborhoods. during overnight hours when official programs were not available. Officer Wong had initially encountered this network while investigating reports of suspicious activity that turned out to be neighbors providing assistance to families and elderly residents who needed help during nighttime emergencies and crises. Her investigation had revealed an elaborate system of mutual support that operated according to informal agreements and shared understandings about community responsibility. Network included retired nurses who provided medical care and health monitoring for elderly residents, former teachers who offered tutoring and educational support for children whose parents worked night shifts, and skilled tradespeople who performed emergency repairs and maintenance that could not wait for normal business hours. Officer Wong's reports documented how this informal network provided services that were more comprehensive and responsive than many official programs, that operated with remarkable efficiency and coordination despite having no formal organizational structure or funding sources. The network members seemed to possess detailed knowledge of who needed assistance, when help was most needed, and what kinds of services would be most effective in addressing different types of problems. They had developed communication systems that enabled rapid response to emergencies while maintaining the privacy and dignity of people who received assistance. Officer Wong had spent several months documenting the activities of this informal network, had interviewed participants and recipients of services, and had developed an understanding of how communities could provide comprehensive support systems without formal organization or official recognition. Her reports showed how the network had prevented numerous crises, had enabled elderly residents to remain safely in their homes, had helped families manage childcare challenges during difficult work schedules, and had demonstrated that communities possessed resources and capabilities that were not reflected in official assessments of available services. Officer Wong's follow-up reports noted that the informal network had created something precious, a community where people could count on receiving help when they needed it, where individual welfare was protected by neighbors who understood that collective security required mutual assistance, where problems were addressed before they became crises because people were paying attention to each other's needs. Sarah found herself thinking about the network members who had dedicated their skills and time to serving their community through informal arrangements that operated outside official recognition or compensation. People who had understood that community welfare required the active participation of residents who were willing to take responsibility for each other's safety and well-being. Informal service network represented more than just volunteer assistance. It represented a commitment to the principle that communities could provide comprehensive support systems through informal cooperation, that professional services and official programs were not always necessary for ensuring that people's needs were met, that neighbors could care for each other more effectively than bureaucratic institutions, when they were motivated by genuine concern and personal relationships. Night shift officers that Sarah observed all seemed to understand that their role included witnessing and documenting these informal networks of care, recognizing that community safety and welfare depended as much on citizen cooperation as on official law enforcement activities. The darkness created opportunities for observing how communities actually functioned when they were not performing for official audiences, revealing networks of mutual support that operated according to principles of reciprocity and shared responsibility. The steady rhythm of paperwork and documentation that characterized night shift work had created an archive of evidence that communities possessed resources and capabilities that were not reflected in official assessments of their needs and problems. The reports that filled the basement archive represented more than just police work. They were documentation of how people cared for each other when they thought no one was keeping track. Evidence that community welfare was maintained through countless acts of anonymous assistance and informal cooperation. As Sarah continued through the quiet hours at the precinct, she began to understand that she had discovered something remarkable, an archive of evidence that communities could function according to principles of mutual care and shared responsibility. That formal institutions and official programs were often less important than informal networks of cooperation and assistance. That the darkness held not just secrets and mysteries, but also proof that people could be trusted to care for each other in ways that created safety and security for everyone. The fluorescent lights hummed their steady lullaby above the night shift officers as they continued their careful work of observation and documentation, bearing witness to the hidden life of a community that revealed its true character during the quiet hours when most people were asleep, and only the dedicated few remained awake to ensure that help was available for anyone who needed it.